Part 1 of A Christmas Miscellany 2023. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. A Christmas Miscellany 2023 by various authors. Part 1. The Christmas Ghost. Unemployment in one of our oldest industries by Stephen Leacock. The other night I was sitting up late, way after 9 o'clock, thinking about Christmas because it was getting near at hand. And like everybody else who muses on that subject, I was thinking of the great changes that have taken place in regard to Christmas. I was contrasting Christmas in the old country house of a century ago with the fires roaring up the chimneys and Christmas in the modern apartment on the 9th floor with the gasoline generator turned on for the maid's bath. I was thinking of the old stagecoach on the snowy road with its roof piled high with Christmas turkeys and a rosy-faced guard blowing on a key bugle and the passengers getting down every mile or so at a crooked inn to drink hot spiced ale, and I was comparing all that with the upper berth number 6, car 220, train number 53. I was thinking of the Christmas landscape of long ago, when night settled down upon it with a twinkle of light from the houses miles apart among the spruce trees, and contrasting the scene with the glare of motor lights upon the highways of today. I was thinking of the lonely highwayman shivering round with his clumsy pistols, and comparing the poor fellow's efforts with the high-class bandits of today, blowing up a steel express car with nitroglycerin and disappearing in a roar of gasoline explosions. In other words, I was contrasting yesterday and today, and on the whole, yesterday seemed all to the good. Nor was it only the warmth and romance and snugness of the old Christmas that seemed superior to our days, but Christmas carried with it then a special kind of thrill, with its queer terrors, its empty heaths, its lonely graveyards, and its house that stood alone in a wood haunted. And thinking of that, it occurred to me how completely the ghost business seems to be dying out of our Christmas literature. Not so very long ago, there couldn't be a decent Christmas story or Christmas adventure without a ghost in it, whereas nowadays... And just at that moment I looked and saw that there was a ghost in the room. I can't imagine how he got in, but there he was, sitting in the other easy chair in the dark corner, away from the firelight. He had on my own dressing gown, and one saw but little of his face. "Are you a ghost?" I asked. "Yes," he said, "worse luck, I am." I noticed as he spoke that he seemed to wave and shiver as if he were made of smoke. I couldn't help but pity the poor fellow, he seemed so immaterial. "Do you mind," he went on in the same dejected tone, "if I sit here and haunt you for a while?" "Oh, by all means," I said, "please do." "Thanks," he answered, "I haven't had anything decent to work on for years and years. This is Christmas Eve, isn't it?" "Yes," I said, "Christmas Eve." "Used to be my busiest night," the ghost complained, "best night of the whole year. And now—" "Say," he said, "would you believe it? I went down this evening to that dinner dance they have at the Ritz-Carlton, and I thought I'd haunt it. Thought I'd stand behind one of the tables as a silent spectre, the way I used to in King George III's time." "Well?" I said. "They put me out," groaned the ghost. "The head waiter came up to me and said they didn't allow silent spectres in the dining room. I was put out." He groaned again. "You seem," I said, "rather down on your luck." "Can you wonder?" said the ghost, and another shiver rippled up and down him. "I can't get anything to do. Talk of the unemployed. Listen," he went on, speaking with something like animation. "Let me tell you the story of my life." "Can you make it short?" I said. "Oh, I'll try. 100 years ago—" "Oh, I say!" I protested. "I committed a terrible crime, a murder on the highway." "You'd get 6 months for that nowadays," I said. "I was never detected. An innocent man was hanged. I died, but I couldn't rest. I haunted the house beside the highway where the murder had been done. It had happened on Christmas Eve, and so, every year on that night— "Oh, I know," I interrupted. "You were heard dragging round a chain and moaning and that sort of thing. I've often read about it." "Precisely," said the ghost, "and for about 80 years it worked out admirably. People became afraid, the house was deserted, trees and shrubs grew thick around it, the wind whistled through its empty chimneys and its broken windows, and at night the lonely wayfarer went shuddering past and heard with terror the sound of a cry, scarce human, while a cold sweat—" "Oh, quite so," I said, "a cold sweat. And what next?" "Well, the days of the motor car came, and they paved the highway and knocked down the house and built a big garage there, with electricity as bright as day. You can't haunt a garage, can you? I tried to stick on and do a little groaning, but nobody seemed to pay any attention. And anyway, I got nervous about the gasoline. I'm too immaterial to be around where there's gasoline. A fellow would blow up, wouldn't he?" "Oh, he might," I said. "So what happened?" "Well, one day somebody in the garage actually saw me, and he threw a monkey wrench at me and told me to go to hell out of that garage. So I went." "After that?" "I haunted around. I've kept on haunting around, but it's no good. There's nothing in it. Houses, hotels, I've tried it all. Once I thought that if I couldn't make a hit any other way, at least I could haunt children. You remember how little children used to live in terror of ghosts and see them in the dark corners of their bedrooms. Well, I admit it was a low-down thing to do, but I tried that." "And it didn't work?" "Work? I should say not. I went one night to a bedroom where a couple of little boys were sleeping, and I started in with a few groans and then half materialized myself so that I could just be seen. One of the kids sat up in bed and nudged the other and said, 'Say, I do believe there's a ghost in the room.' And the other said, 'Hold on, don't scare him. Let's get the radio set and see if it'll go right through him.' They both hopped out of bed as brisk as bees, and one called downstairs, 'Dad, we've got a ghost up here. We don't know whether he's just an emanation or partially material. We're going to stick radio into him.' Believe me," continued the ghost, "that was all I waited to hear. Electricity just knocks me edgeways." He shuddered. Then he went on, "Well, it's been like that ever since. Nowhere to go and nothing to haunt. I've tried all the big hotels, railway stations, everywhere. Once I tried to haunt a Pullman car, but I had hardly started before I observed a notice, 'Quiet is requested for those already retired,' and I had to quit." "Well, then," I said, "why don't you just get immaterial or dematerial or whatever you call it, and keep so? Why not go away wherever you belong and stay there?" "Well, that's the worst of it," answered the ghost. "They won't let us. They haul us back. These spiritualists have learned the trick of it, and they just summon us up every time they like. They get half a crown apiece for each materialization. But what do we get?" The ghost paused, and a sort of spasm went all through him. "Gall darn it," he exclaimed, "they're at me now. There's a group of fools somewhere sitting round a table at a Christmas Eve party, and they're calling up a ghost just for fun. A darned poor notion of fun, I call it. I'd like to—" But his voice trailed off. He seemed to collapse as he sat, and my dressing gown fell on the floor. And at that moment I heard the ringing of the bells that meant it was Christmas Eve midnight, and I knew that the poor fellow had been dragged off to work. End of Part 1. Part 2 of A Christmas Miscellany 2023 by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, Mr. Pepys's Christmases, from The Powder of Sympathy by Christopher Morley. Christmas being the topic, suppose we call upon Mr. Samuel Pepys for testimony. The imperishable diarist had as keen a faculty of enjoyment as any man who ever lived. He wrote one of the world's greatest love stories, the story of his own zealous, inquisitive, jocund love of life. Surely it is not amiss to inquire what record be left as to the Festival of Cheer. On 7 of the 9 Christmases in the diary, Mr. Pepys went to church, sometimes more than once, though when he went twice he admits he fell asleep. The music and the ladies' finery were undoubtedly part of the attraction. "Very great store of fine women there is in this church, more than I know anywhere else about us," is his note for Christmas 1664. But in that generously mixed and volatile heart there was a valve of honest aspiration and piety. One can imagine him sitting in his pew. On Christmas 1661 he nearly left the church in a huff because the verger didn't come forward to open the pew door for him. His alert mind giving close attention to the sermon of his favorite Mr. Mills, busy with sudden resolutions of virtue and industry, yet happily conscious of any beauty within eyeshot. The giving of presents was not a large part of Christmas in those days. In 1662, Mr. Gowden gave Pepys a great chine of beef and 3 dozen of tongues, but this had its drawbacks. Pepys had to give 5 shillings to the man who brought it, and also half a crown to the porters. Drink and food were the important part of the festival. At Christmas 1660, Mr. and Mrs. Pepys, with Tom Pepys as guest, enjoyed a good shoulder of mutton and a chicken. This was a brave Christmas for Mrs. Pepys. She had a new mantle. We must remember that the fair Elizabeth, though already married 5 years, was then only 20 years old. Not all Mrs. Pepys's Christmases were as merry as that, I fear. On Christmas 1663 she was troubled by anxious thoughts. "My wife began, I know not whether by design or chance, to inquire what she should do, if I should by any accident die, to which I did give her some slight answer, but shall make a good use of it to bring myself to some settlement for her sake." Why haven't the ingenious life insurance advertisers made use of this telling bit of copy? Christmas 1668 seems to have been poor Mrs. Pepys's worst Yule, but perhaps it was only her natural feminine frivolity that caused the sadness. Samuel says, "Dinner alone with my wife, who, poor wretch, sat undressed all day till 10 at night, altering and lacing of a noble petticoat." This noble petticoat was perhaps to be worn at the play they attended the next day. "Women pleased." What a pleasant Christmas card that scene would make! Mrs. Pepys sitting negligée over the niceties of her needlework, with Samuel beside her, making the boy read to me the life of Julius Caesar. But we do not get, as the current phrase is, Mrs. Pepys at all, if we think of her as merely the irresponsible girl. For at Christmas 1666 we read, "Lay pretty long in bed, and then rose, leaving my wife desirous to sleep, having sat up till 4 this morning, seeing her maids make mince pies." Ah, we have no such mince pies nowadays. Mrs. Pepys's mince pies were evidently worthy the tradition of that magnificent delicacy, for at Christmas 1662, when Elizabeth was ill abed, Samuel records, with an evident touch of regret, that he had to send abroad for one. Which brings us back to the Christmas viands. In 1662, besides the mince pie from abroad, he dined by my wife's bedside with great content, having a mess of brave plum porridge and a roasted pullet. We are tempted to think 1666 was Samuel's best Christmas. Parson Mills made a good sermon. "Then home and dined well on some good ribs of beef, roasted, and mince pies. Only my wife, brother, and Barker, and plenty of good wine of my own, and my heart full of true joy." After dinner they had a little music, and he spent the evening making a catalogue of his books, reducing the names of all my books to an alphabet, which is probably the happiest task a man of Pepys's temperament could enjoy. Christmas Eve, 1667, was evidently a cheerful evening. Mr. Pepys stopped in at the Rose Tavern for some burnt wine, walked round the city in the moonlight, and homeward early in the morning in such content that I dropped money in 5 or 6 places, which I was the willinger to do, it being Christmas Day, and so home, and there find my wife in bed, and Jane and the maid making pies. The evening of that Christmas, Mrs. Pepys read aloud to him the history of the drummer of Mr. Mompesson, apparently a kind of contemporary Phillips Oppenheim, a strange story of spies, and worth reading indeed. It was only in 1660 that the Christmas cheer was a little too much for our diarist. December 27, 1660, about the middle of the night I was very ill, I think with eating and drinking too much, and so I was forced to call the maid, who pleased my wife and I in her running up and down so innocently in her smock. It is painful to this tracker of Mr. Pepys's vestiges to note that on Christmas Day, 1662, Bishop Morley at the Chapel Royal made but a poor sermon. The bishop apparently rebuked the levity of the court. It was worth observing how far they are come from taking the reprehensions of a bishop seriously, that they all laugh in the chapel when he reflected on their ill actions and courses. He did much press us to joy in these public days of joy, and to hospitality, but one that stood by whispered in my ear that the bishop do not spend one groat to the poor himself. In 1665, we fear that Samuel indulged himself in church with some rather cynical thoughts. Saw a wedding in the church, and the young couple so merry one with another, and strange to see what delight we married people have to see these poor fools decoyed into our condition, every man and woman gazing and smiling at them. One could continue for some space recounting the eupeptic Pepys in his Christmas merriments, so large an edifice of pleasing conjecture can be built upon even his slightest notes. One observes, for instance, that on December 27, 1664, when my wife and all her folks came to make Christmas gambols, Samuel left the party and went to bed. This was very different from his usual habit when there was fun going. He was annoyed also that on this occasion his wife revelled all night, not coming to bed until 8 the next morning, which vexed me a little, but I believe there was no hurt in it at all, but only mirth. So we take leave of the Christmases of the Pepys. 1668 is the last one recorded, the time when Elizabeth stayed at home all day altering her petticoat. After supper, the boy played some music on the lute, and Samuel's mind was in mighty content. Let us think kindly of the good fellow, and not forget that he coined one of the enduring phrases of English literature, a phrase that is no such ineffective summary of all the lives of men, and so to bed. End of Part 2. Part 3 of A Christmas Miscellany 2023 by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, What Kind of a Dog? From The Powder of Sympathy by Christopher Morley. "What kind of a dog is he?" said the Seacliff veterinary over the phone. We must confess we were stumped. All we could say was that he is, just a kind of a dog. We didn't like to say that he is a synthetic hound, and that his full name is Haphazard Gissing 1. We didn't like to admit, at any rate over the telephone, that one of his grandmothers may have been a Dachshund, and that certainly one of his brothers-in-law is an Airedale. But at any rate it was fixed that we should take our excellent Gissing over to the kennels to be boarded while we were in the city. Gissing's behavior was odd. He seemed in some inscrutable way to suspect that something was going to happen. The night before his departure he disappeared, and was away all night, saying good-bye to his cronies, we suppose. When we came home early in the afternoon to convoy him to Seacliff, he was nowhere to be found. But about supper-time he turned up, looking more haggard and disreputable than ever. There was a fresh scar on his face, and he was very hungry. He ate his supper hurriedly, with no dignity at all. As soon as he heard the rattle of his chain, his spirits went very low. But the admirable creature was docile. Dogs are profoundly religious at heart. They put their trust in their deities. Unlike cats, who are determined atheists and fight to the last against fate, dogs accept calmly what they see is ordered by the gods. Gissing hopped into Dame quickly without protest and sat in silence during the ride. His nose was unusually cold, but then that may have been only the winter evening. He had somewhat the bearing of one who is going to the dentist. Dog fanciers are always baffled and set at naught when they see Gissing, but the Seacliff veterinarian made the most penetrating remark when we arrived. He is accustomed, indeed, to dogs of high degree, such dogs as are favored by the north shore of Long Island, and Gissing was rather a shock to him. After a long look, "What is his name?" he said. "Gissing," we replied, with just a little of that embarrassment we always feel when such questions are asked, for it is generally shown in the manner of the inquirer that Gissing is an unusual name, particularly for a dog who looks as though he ought to be called Rover. So we said, perhaps a little defiantly, "Gissing." But the doctor misunderstood it. "Guessing," he said dubiously, and looked again at the abashed quadruped. "That's because he keeps you guessing what breed he is." It amuses us the more to have Gissing staying there, associating with the lordly dogs of Long Islanders, who are spending the snow season in Florida, because we feel that it is rather like sending a child to a fashionable boarding school. It is probably useless as far as education is concerned, but it ought to be an interesting experience, and he may pick up a little polish. Gissing may make friends with some influential dogs who will be of help to him in future life. Who knows? It is expensive, we admit, but since we paid nothing for him in the first place and have used him liberally for copy, we feel that we owe Gissing this opportunity to improve himself. At any rate, he has promised to write us a letter from time to time, and we shall see how he gets on. End of Part 3. Part 4 of A Christmas Miscellany 2023 by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 4, A Christmas Card, from The Powder of Sympathy by Christopher Morley. As the Christmas season approaches, it sits heavily upon our mind that there are some to whom we should like to say a word of respectful admiration. First of these is Woodrow Wilson. This, you may think, is a gesture both irrelevant and impertinent on our part. We cannot help it. We feel, as the Friends say, a concern. The conjunction of the Christmas month, the conference on limitation of armaments, the hopes and memories of all honest men, Mr. Wilson's coming birthday, makes the occasion irresistible. There are some things that must be said. Woodrow Wilson has found the peace he sought. Never before, perhaps, did a public man enjoy such posthumous privilege in his own lifetime. He has joined, in Melville's noble phrase, the choice hidden handful of the divine inert. This phrase requires scrutiny. The divinity is not ascribed to Mr. Wilson, but to inertia. Silence, thought, withdrawal from the maddening struggles of mankind. These are divine. These are godlike. If there were ever any doubt as to his having qualities of true greatness, consider the patience and decency of his present silence. It is a silence, one feels, not of bitterness, but of honorable dignity. Sometimes, tucked away in the papers, one finds a single line, or so, that gives us more to ponder than all the rest of the day's news. Such an item was the following, quoted lately by Mr. Tumulty as having been said by Mr. Wilson to one of his advisers at the Paris conference. "Monsieur Clemenceau called me a pro-German and abruptly left the room." They said this man was impatient and stubborn, yet he endured insult calmly in the pursuit of his strangely hoped-for peace. The post-armistice career of Mr. Wilson has been called a tragedy. We do not see it so. The Paris Conference, it is easy to see it now, was foredoomed to a certain measure of failure. On sand one puts up a tent, not a house. Moreover, insofar as that conference is concerned, Mr. Wilson has suffered a double fatality. He has never spoken candidly for himself. He has been unfortunate in those who have spoken for him. It has been the habit of those naive and loyally affectionate souls who have been closest to him to assure us of his subtlety and quicksilver craft. We cannot see it. He has seemed to us, always, a man of genuine simplicity, what would have been called at one time a righteous man. It is an odd thing that when you say a character is rooted in simplicity and piety, some will conclude that you are sneering. His character is a great character. Those influences which shake and unsettle men's fibre more than anything else, it has endured in full measure. Adulation and hatred. The anger and mockery which were lavished upon Wilson are interesting to contemplate. But so far as one can see, they did not trouble that stubborn zeal. There was a Cromwellian grimness and singleness of heart in his battle with Europe. You remember what Cromwell said, if Carlyle can be trusted as a reporter, "Would we have peace without a worm, lay we foundations of justice and righteousness." For that he struggled, burdening himself beyond human strength. For that he compromised, as all men do. For that he incurred the malice of all aspirants, both the pure and the impure. It is amazing to remember the power and depth of that malice. In a perverse way it is almost encouraging to remember it. It proves so excellently that this earth is still the fallen star, the cindered Eden, in which merely human failings incur more than human angers. What a gruesome life that of politics must be, and yet when, in our recent history, were more positive virtues and high-minded hopes brought into the muddled ferment of national politics? Do you remember how this man lay at death's door for many silent months, and how ill-suppressed were the satisfaction and the sneer? What was his crime? We used to wonder. Only that he had believed the world was ripe for some strokes of simplicity and unselfishness. Little by little, the minds of fair-hearted men are returning to realization and gratitude. There is nothing now accomplished, or even accomplishable, in matters of international dealing that Woodrow Wilson was not fighting for 3 years ago. The granolithic minds of the old stand-patters and the luxurious sniffs of young, hot doctrinaires formed for a while a quaint partnership of scorn. Nor would we ourselves deny that there were many things to lament. But the world still waits for a competent understanding and judicial expression of Woodrow Wilson's service to men. It was not a perfect service, for it was marred by necessary mortal blunders and qualms. For that, perhaps, we reverence it the more, and when the just tribute comes, perhaps it will come from the hand of some great writer to whom the puerilities of partisan quabble fade into their deserved shadow, to whom the humor and the pathos will be evident, and, most evident of all, the dignity and austerity of a great human hope, frustrated and postponed, but an addition to the honor of the race. Perhaps it will come from the hand of some great dramatist, with the dramatist's art that can revive great figures, great moments, can purge the occasion of what was merely peevish and fortuitous, and remind us of truths and visions we lost in the hurly-burly of the time. It is sheer selfishness on our part to hope that some such expression may come soon. We are jealous for the credit of this generation. We are proud to have lived in days when men suffered so hideously, and yet did and said and wrote great things. We would like it to be said of this generation that it recognized greatness in its own time. That would be an honorable thing to be able to say. Have we erected from our imagination a figure that is not really there? We think not. And so, with humility and hesitation, but impelled by a motive we cannot resist, we would like to say to Woodrow Wilson that there are many who gratefully wish him Merry Christmas. End of Part 4. Part 5 of A Christmas Miscellany 2023 by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 5, A Christmas Soliloquy from The Powder of Sympathy by Christopher Morley. 1. In the most peaceful spot known to American life, a railroad train, we had several hours of that pleasure which offices are devised to prevent, viz. Meditation, or even, if we may dare so high, thought. Our thoughts, or whatever they are that go round inside you when you are sitting passively in a train, were tinged by the approach of Christmas. There was evidently something in the bright air and pre-Christmas feeling of that December afternoon that even softened the heart of the news butcher, for we noticed as the train hastened along the Connecticut shore, his manner became more and more fond. He began at Grand Central in a mood of formality, even austerity. "Lots of nice reading matter here, gentlemen," he cried. "Got a nice short story book." By book he meant, of course, magazine. "To kill time for a couple hours." We thought perhaps a little sadly of the irony of begging men to annul time when they had happily reached almost the only place in America where it can be enjoyed, examined, taken apart, and looked at. But perhaps due to a niggardly spirit among his congregation in the smoker, the agent gradually became more fraternal. His manner was almost bedside by the time we had got to New Rochelle. "Chocolate, peppermints, figs, and lemon drops, fellas?" And at Stamford he was beginning to despair. "Peanuts? They're delicious, boys." We made up our mind, by the way, as to the correct answer to our old question, where does New England begin? The frontier is at South Norwalk, for there we saw a sign, the New England Cereal Company, and just about there, also, begin the billboards urging codfish, surely the authentic image and superscription of New England. Of course, there is a great deal to think about in the signs you see along the track. There is that notice, "Dangerous, live wires, keep away," which is a good advice socially as well as electrically. But we thought that these warnings were a bit unfair to New England, where there are fewer human live wires than there are south of the Harlem Strait. We remembered a certain club in Philadelphia, of which the bitter-minded used to say it was the only organization in the world whose membership was 100% live wires, regular fellows, and go-getters. As we went through Greenwich, Riverside, Westport, we admired the blue shore of Long Island lying so placidly across the Sound, and it struck us, almost with a sense of shock, that there are a great many people to whom Long Island is only a dim, unreal haze on the horizon. Yes, foreign travel is a brisk aperient to the mind. We remembered, as we always do when traveling on the New Haven, Robert Louis Stevenson's delight when he first went that way. In one of his letters he speaks of the succession of beautiful rocky coves that saluted his eye. "Why," he wrote, "have Americans been so unfair to their own country?" It would be impossible to tell you all the things we thought about. They have already faded. We did not forget our duty, as a traveling mandarin, to be a little magisterial when occasion seemed to require it. In the station at New Haven, for instance, there is a young woman, most remarkably coiffed, who presides at the tobacco counter. She seemed of a notably cheerful and lenient disposition, and we ventured a remark upon the weather. She said she wished it would snow, so that she could have some real fun, by which she meant, we dare say, a little bobsledding with the youths of Yale College. We thought that this showed a dangerous inappreciation of her general opulent good fortune in being young, comely, and attached to a tobacco traffic. We looked at her quite sternly and said, "Young women can always have a good time, and no matter what the weather." To our regret, as we hastened on toward the Springfield train, we heard her squeaking with mirth. But the starting point of our meditation was an attempt to describe and dissect this curious pre-Christmas feeling, which is one of the most subtle and genuine adventures of the whole year. When we try to examine it in its components, we see that the whole thing is too delicate and pervasive for analysis. What are its ingredients? We said to ourselves. We thought of the little shrill, tingling bells of the Salvation Army. We thought of the warm, juicy smell of roasting chicken that outgushes from a certain rotisserie in Jamaica, Long Island. We thought of the bright colors and toys in the windows of that glorious Main Street in Jamaica, which is where we do our Christmas shopping. We thought of all the sparkle, the chill, clear air, the general bustle of the streets that one associates with the Christmas season, and of the undercurrent of dumb and troubled realization of human misery and stupidity and frustration that comes to some more clearly now than at any other time. And we thought also of the mockers and the cheerful skeptics to whom any candid expression of a simple human emotion is cause for nipping laughter. Never mind, we said to ourselves, there is at least one time of year when they can all afford to put away their shining paradoxes and their gingerbread cynicism, like the gilded circus wagons we saw shut up in winter quarters at Bridgeport. Probably the most sensitive and complex of human sensations is the pre-Christmas feeling, because it is not merely personal, but communal. Not merely communal, but national. Not merely national, but even international. We know then that for a few weeks a great part of the world is busily thinking of the same things: how it can surprise its friends, how it can encourage the miserable, how it can amuse the harmless. Even the dingiest street has its pathetic badges of color. It is a great thing to have such a widespread community of sentiment, which, however varying in expression, is identical in essence. One may be amused when he sees the Christmas annuals published by Australian magazines and finds under the title, "A Happy Christmas in New South Wales," a photograph of girls in muslin enjoying themselves by picnicking along shady streams with canoes and mosquito nettings. That kind of Christmas, we think, would seem very grotesque for us, but our friends the New South Welsh evidently find it exhilarating. But it is that mysterious and agreeable pre-Christmas feeling which is the best of the whole matter. Christmas Day itself is sometimes almost too feverish a business of picking up blizzards of wrapping paper, convincing the urchin that his own toys are just as interesting as the urchiness's, and treading on tiptoe for fear of walking on the clockwork train or the lurking doll. At Christmas time we always think, probably we are the only person who does, of the late Admirable William Stubbs, once Bishop of Oxford and Regius Professor of History, the author of those 3 fat mulberry-colored volumes, The Constitutional History of England, a work far from easy to read, and which, when we were compelled to study it, seemed of an intolerable dullness. Bishop Stubbs, in the dreadful words of the Dictionary of National Biography, never forgot that he was a clergyman. It is also said that his lectures never attracted a large audience. But what we are getting at is this, that on Christmas Day, 1873, the excellent bishop retired from the gambols and gaieties of his 5 sons and 1 daughter, and wrote the preface to his history. We love to think of him, a worthy man, shutting himself up from the Yuletide riot in roomy old Kettle Hall, now a part of Trinity College, Oxford, and sitting down to write those words, "The history of institutions cannot be mastered, can scarcely be approached, without an effort." Now that we are somewhat matured, we think that we could probably reread his constitutional history with much profit. In that Christmas Day preface, written while the young Stubbses were, we suppose, filling the house with juvenile clamor, there is one phrase that catches our eye as we take the book down for its annual dusting. Constitutional history reads the exploits and characters of men by a different light from that shed by the false glare of arms. The world's heroes are no heroes to it. 2. We shall remember the Christmas of 1921, partly at any rate by the wonderful succession of pellucid, frosty, moonlit nights that preceded it. We walked round and round our rustic grange trying to focus just what we wanted to say to our friends as a Christmas greeting. A curious misery was upon our spirits, for we felt that in many ways we had been recreant to the spirit of friendship. When we think, for instance, of the unanswered letters, we have sinned horribly. Yet we wanted to give ourselves the selfish pleasure of saying a word of affection to those who have been kind to us, and to whom, in the foolish but unavoidable hurry of daily affairs, we have been discourteous. The way to love humanity, we said to ourselves, is not to see too much of it. Moreover, to write a kind of Christmas sermon is apparently to put oneself into the loathsome false position of seeming to assume those virtues one praises. We remember the first clergyman who made an impression upon our childish mind. It was in a country church in a village where we were visiting some kinsmen. This parson was a great bearded fellow, long since gone the way of flesh. He was a bit of a ritualist. His white surplice and embroidered streamers of red and gold impressed us enormously. He came very close to our idea of divinity itself. We used to sit and hear him booming away and think vaguely how wonderful to be as virtuous as that. When the organ throbbed and his vast gray beard rose ecstatically above his white-robed chest, we thought that here was goodness incarnate. Years later, we asked what had become of him. We heard that he had lost his job because he drank too much. The more we think about that, the tenderer our feeling is towards his memory. Only the sinner has a right to preach. Thinking about this pre-Christmas feeling, and wanting to say something about it, but not knowing how, we got, as we started to tell you, on a train. We went for a few hours to another city. There we saw, exhilaratingly different, but fundamentally the same, the shining business of life going forward. The people in that city were carrying on their own affairs, were hot foot upon their own concerns. We saw their eager, absorbed faces, and what struck us was, here are all these people whose lives are totally sundered from our own, but they have, at heart, the same hopes and aspirations, the same follies, weaknesses, disgusts, and bitternesses as ourselves. And the same would be so of 1,000 cities and of 100,000. Then we got into one of those things called a sleeper, which ought to be called a thinker, an ideal cloister for meditation. All down the dark aisle we could hear the innocent snores of our fellows, but we ourselves lay wakeful. We felt rather like the mystic Russian peasant who goes to bed in his coffin. We were whirled along through a midnight landscape of transparent white moonlight, and quite as cheerful as the dead child in Hans Andersen, borne through starry space by the angel, we made our peace with everything. We claim no credit for this. We would have slept if we could. There was a huge bump in the middle of the berth, and there was a vile, cold draught. We read part of Stephen Crane's magnificent sketch, The Scotch Express, but those miserable little dim lamps. And then, strangely enough, there came a sudden realization of the amazing richness and fecundity of life. Every signboard along the railroad track is an illustration of it. Hideous enough, still it is a kind of endless vista into the huge jumble of human affairs. Here is a billboard crying out something about a spark plug, or about the Hotel Teresa, or on the side of a little shabby brick tenement a painted legend about bromo seltzer. Someone worked to put that advertisement up. Someone had sufficient credulity or gambling audacity to pay for it. Somewhere children are fed and clothed by that spark plug. Christmas itself suddenly seemed a kind of spark plug that ignites the gases and vapors of selfishness and distrust and explodes them away. Everything seemed extraordinarily gallant and exciting. Take the Hotel Teresa, for instance. We had never heard of it before. It is on 125th Street, we gathered. We would like to wager that all sorts of adventures are lying in wait up there, if we can slip away and go looking for them. As we were lying in our cool tomb, Carl Sandburg's phrase, in the thinking car, we meditated something like this. Christmas is certainly a time when a reasonable man should overhaul his religion and see if it amounts to anything. Christmas is a time when millions of people are thinking of the same thing. Humanity is so constituted that you can never get the world to agree about things that have happened, but it is happily at one about something that probably never happened, the Christmas story as told in the Gospels. If millions of simple people believe a thing, that doesn't make it true, but perhaps it makes it better than true. It makes it poetry. It makes it beauty. Stephen Graham says in that moving book, With Russian Pilgrims to Jerusalem, which certainly ought to be read by everyone who is at all interested in religion. It is published by Thomas Nelson and Sons. You may have to get it from London. We don't believe it is in print over here. Stephen Graham says, true religion takes its rise out of mystery and not out of miracle. Religion, which has proved to be one of the greatest dividing and hostilizing forces in the world, is in its essence just the opposite. Surely, in the origin of the word, religion means a binding together, a ligament. Now, take the most opposite people you can think of, say Babe Ruth and the Sultan of Turkey. Is there still a sultan? Or say Mr. Balfour and the chap who runs the elevator in his office. No matter how different these may be in training and outlook, there will be some province of human thought and emotion, some small sensitive spot of the mind, in which they can meet and feel at one. We can imagine them sitting down together for lunch and having a mutually improving time, each admiring and enjoying the other. Widen the incongruity of the individuals as much as you like. Imagine Mr. Joseph Conrad and Dr. Bertold Baer, or Mr. James W. Eliot, the business builder, and Mahatma Gandhi. We care not who they are. If they can make their thoughts intelligible to each other, they can find that remote but definite point of tangency where any experienced mind can meet and sympathize with any other human mind, discussing the problems of destiny which are common to all. It is this common multiple of humanity, this sensitive pulse in the mind, this realization of a universal share in an overburdening mystery too real to be ignored, but too terrific to be defined or blurbed about, that is the province of religion. And then the devil of it, for there is always a devil in every sensible religion, is that the best way to be sure there is this possible point of junction is not to attempt to find it. Both Mr. Balfour and the cheerful elevator boy would probably pray heartily to be delivered from sitting down to lunch together. This mysterious, mental, sensitive spot that we speak of remains sensitive only as long as it remains private and secret. Perhaps religion can be defined as a sense of human fellowship that is best preserved by not being too companionable. We were thinking, too, how extremely modern and contemporary the Christmas story seems. It is appropriate that the final installment of the income tax falls just before Christmas. The same thing happened 1,921 years ago. There went out a decree that all the world should be taxed, says Luke. That was why Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem, to pay their tax. And we can imagine that the Bethlehem Evening Star, if there had been newspapers at that time, would have had a column of social notes just similar in spirit to those of our own press day. The arrival of Joseph and Mary would not have been noticed. We might have read, Mr. and Mrs. Pharisee of White Sepulchre, Galilee, are spending the winter at the Tiberias Hotel. The Honorable Pontius Pilate, governor of Judea, is enjoying a weekend visit with Tetrarch and Mrs. Herod at the Tetrarchal mansion. Mr. and Mrs. Philip Herod are traveling in Syria for the winter. Mrs. Herod was, before her marriage, Miss Herodias, socially prominent. Professor Melchior, Professor Balthazar, and Professor Gaspar arrived last night from the West. They are said to be in town for some astronomical investigations. The professors had great trouble in securing hotel accommodations, the city being so crowded. Reverend Caiaphas, one of the most respected high priests in this diocese, has an apartment for the winter at Phylactery Court. The train pursued its steady way through the moonlight, and the silvered loveliness of earth and trees made us think generously of our own country. We are still foolish enough to love this America of ours with a dumb, queer love. We still believe that in spite of senates and live wires, in spite of the antics of some of the half-educated and well-meaning men who govern us, this country has a unique contribution to make to the world in future years. There should be international Christmas cards. There should be some way of one nation surprising another with a friendly message on the morning of mornings. We believe, perhaps we are not impartial, that the English-speaking race, by its contribution to human liberty, has a right to a leading place in the world's affairs. But if it gives way to its characteristic vice of arrogance, we weary of it. We think of the feminine brilliance, charm, and emotional volatility of France, of the beautiful sensibility and self-control of Japan, of the melancholy idealism of Russia, of the sober industry of Germany. Have we, then, nothing to learn from these? Printer's ink is scattered about these days with such profusion that it becomes almost meaningless. Sitting in the subway and raising our eye plaintively from a newspaper to an advertising card, we have wondered which was the greater menace, Pyrrhia or Japan. Both were said to be menaces. It is our own conviction that nothing can be a menace to America but itself. This seems a dismal kind of Christmas homily, but we enjoyed ourselves immensely while we were meditating it in our lower berth. Very likely, if it had been an upper berth, the result would have been different. In any case, we take the liberty of wishing our friends, who are by this time too indurated to feel surprise or chagrin at anything we may say, a Merry Christmas. We wish for them a cheerful and laborious New Year, with good books to read, and both the time and the inclination to think. We even wish for them occasional eccentric seizures, such as we feel at the present, when we have a dim suspicion that behind the noble and never sufficiently praised comedy of life there lies some simple, satisfying answer to many gropings. A simple thing, but too terrible and far-reaching ever to be wholly put into practice by puzzled and compromising mankind. We mean, of course, the teachings of Christ. Consider the German generals and military men who lost everything, but the German toy makers conquered the world. End of Part 5. Part 6 of A Christmas Miscellany 2023 by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 6, The Animal's Christmas Tree by the Reverend John Punnett Peters. Once upon a time, the animals decided to have a Christmas tree, and this was how it came about. The swifts and the swallows in the chimneys in the country houses, awakened from their sleep by joy and laughter, had stolen down and peeped in upon scenes of happiness, the center of which was always an evergreen tree covered with wonderful fruit, bright balls of many colors, and sparkling threads of gold and silver, lying like beautiful frostwork among the green fir needles. A sweet, fairy-like figure of a Christ child or an angel rested high among the branches, and underneath the tree were dolls and sleds and skates and drums and toys of every sort, and furs and gloves and tippets, ribbons and handkerchiefs, and all the things that boys and girls need and like. And all about this tree were gathered always little children with faces oh so full of wonderment and expectation, changing to radiant, sparkling merriment as toys and candies were taken off the tree or from underneath its boughs and distributed among them. The swifts and the swallows told their feathered friends all about it, and they told others, both birds and animals, until at last it began to be rumored through all the animal world that on one day in the year the children of men were made wonderfully happy by means of some sort of a festival which they held about a fir tree from the forest. Now, of course, the tame animals and the house animals, the dogs and the cats and the mice, knew something more about this festival, but then they did not exchange visits with the wild animals because they felt themselves above them. They were always trying to be like men and women, you know, putting on airs and pretending to know everything. But after all, they were animals and could not help making friendships now and then with the wild creatures, especially when the men and women were not there. And when they were asked about the Christmas tree, they told still more wonderful stories than the swifts and swallows from the chimneys had told, for some of them had taken part in these festivals, and some had even received presents from the tree, just like the children. They said that the tree was called a Christmas tree because that strange fruit and that wonderful frosting came on it only in the Christmas time, and that the Christmas time was the time when men and women and little children, too, were always kind and good and loving and gave things to one another. And they said, moreover, that on the Christmas tree grew the things which everyone wanted and which would make them happy, and that it was so because in the Christmas time everyone was trying to make everyone else happy, and to think of what other people would like. This, they said, was what they had seen and heard told about the Christmas trees. They did not quite understand why it was so, but they knew that the Christmas tree, when rightly made, brought the Christmas spirit, and they had heard men say that the Christmas spirit was the great thing, and that that was what made everyone happy. Well, the long and short of it was that the animals talked of it in their dens and on their roosts, in the fields and in the forest, wild animals and tame alike, the cows and horses in their stalls, the sheep in their fold, the doves in their cots, and the poultry in the poultry yard, until all agreed that a Christmas tree would be a grand thing for wild and tame alike. Like the men, they too would have a tree of their very own. But how to do it? Then the lion called a meeting of all the creatures, wild and tame, for you know the lion is king of beasts, and when he calls, they all must come. You know, too, that before and during and after these animal congresses, there is a royal peace. The lamb can come to the meeting and sit down by the wolf, and the wolf dare not touch him. The dove may perch on the bough between the hawk and the owl, and neither will harm him, when the great king of beasts has summoned them all together to take counsel. But you know all about the rules of the animals, for you have read them in books, and you have seen the pictures, how the lion sits on his throne with a crown on one side of his head, and all the other creatures gather about, the elephant, the giraffe, the hippopotamus, the buffalo, wolves and tigers and leopards, foxes and deer, goats and sheep, monkeys and orangutans, parrots and robins and turkeys, and swans and storks and eagles and frogs and lizards and alligators, and all the rest besides. Then, when the lion had called the meeting to order, the swifts and the swallows told what they had seen, and a fat little pug dog with a ribbon and a silver bell about his neck wheezed out a story of a Christmas tree that he had seen, and how a silver bell had grown on that tree for him and a whole box of the best sweets he had ever dreamed of, while he lay comfortably snoozing on his cushion before the fire. And a Persian cat, with her hair turned the wrong way, mewed out her story of a Christmas tree that she had attended, and how there was a white mouse made of cream cheese for her, creeping about beneath the branches. Then the monkeys chattered, and the elephants trumpeted, the horses neighed, the hyenas laughed, and each in his own way argued for a Christmas tree, and told what they would do to help to make it. The elephant would go into the forest and choose the tree and pull it up. The buffaloes would drag it in. The giraffe would fix the ornaments on the higher limbs because its neck was long. The monkeys would scramble up where the giraffe could not reach. The squirrels would run out on the slender twigs and help the monkeys. The birds would fly about and get the golden threads and put them on the tree with their beaks. The fireflies would hide themselves among the branches and sparkle like diamonds, and the glowworms promised to help the fireflies by playing candles, if someone would lift them up and put them on the branches. The parrots and paroquets and other birds of gay plumage would give feathers to hang among the branches, and the hummingbirds promised to flutter in and out among the twigs, and the sheep to give white wool to lie like snow among the boughs. Then the parrots screeched and the peacocks screamed with delight, and you and I never could have told whether anybody voted aye or nay. But the lion knew, and the owl, for he was clerk, and set it down in the minutes, as the lion bade him, that all the birds and beasts would do their part. So each planned what he could do. Even the little beetle, who makes great balls of earth, thought that if he could only once see one of those gay balls that grow on the children's Christmas tree, he might make some for the animals' tree. Different birds and beasts told of the oranges and apples and holly berries, and who knows what they could get and hang upon the tree. You see, the animals came from many places, and then, too, they could send the carrier pigeons to go and bring fruit and berries, and who knows what besides, from so far away, because the carrier pigeons can fly through the air no one knows how fast or how far. Well, I cannot tell you everything that each one was going to do, but if you will go and get your Noah's Ark and take the animals out one by one, then you surely will think it out for yourself, for you have all the animals there. And so they arranged how they would ornament the tree, and the next thing was to decide what presents should be hung on the tree or put beneath its boughs, for each one must have his present. Well, after much discussion in roars and bellows, crows and croaks and lows and screams and bleats and baws and grunts, and all the other sounds of bird and beast language, it was voted that each might choose the present he wished hung on the tree. The clerkly owls should call their names one by one, and each might declare his choice. So they began. The parrots and the macaws thought that they would like oranges and bananas and such things, which would look so pretty on the tree, too. And so they were arranged for. The robins and the cedar birds chose cherries, the partridges, partridge berries, the squirrels, red and gray and black nuts and apples and pears. The monkeys said the popcorn strings would do for them, and the cats and dogs, remembering the Christmas gifts which the pug dog and Persian cat had told about, asked for tiny mice made of cream cheese or chocolate. By and by it came the pig's turn to tell his choice. "Grunt, grunt," said the pig, "I want a nice pail of swill hung on the very lowest bough of all." "Ugh!" said the black leopard, so sleek and so clean. "Faugh!" said the gazelle, with his dainty sense of smell. "Nay," said the horse, so daintily groomed. "What?" roared the lion. "What's that you want?" "A pail of swill," grunted the pig. "Each one has chosen what he wants, and I have a right to choose what I want." "But," roared the lion, "each one has chosen something beautiful to make the tree a joy to all." "Grunt, grunt," said the pig. "The parrots and the macaws are going to have oranges and bananas, and the robins and the cedar birds red cherries, the partridges their berries, the squirrels nuts and apples and pears, the dog and the cat their cream and chocolate mice. They all have what they want to eat. Grunt, grunt," said he. "I will have what I want to eat, too, and what I want is a pail of swill." Now you see it had been voted, as I told you, that each should choose what he wanted hung on the tree for him, and so the Lion could not help himself. If the pig chose swill, swill he must have, and angrily he had to roar, "If the pig wants swill, a pail of swill he must have, hung on the lowest bough of the tree." Then the wolf's wicked eyes gleamed, for his turn was next, and he said, "If the pig has swill because he wants swill to eat, I must have what I want to eat, and I want a tender lamb 6 months old." And at that all the lambs and the sheep bleated and bawed. "Ha, ha, ha!" barked the fox. "Then I want a turkey." And the turkeys gobbled in fear. "And I," said the tiger, "want a yearling calf." And the cows and the calves lowed in horror. "And I," said the owl, the clerk, "I want a plump dove." "And I," said the hawk, "will take a rabbit." "And I," said the leopard, "want a deer or a gazelle." Then all was fear and uproar. The hares and the rabbits scuttled into the grass, the gazelles and the deer bounded away, the sheep and cattle crowded close together, the small birds rose in the air in flocks, and the Christmas tree was like to have come to grief and ended, not in Christmas joy, but in fear and hatred and terror. Then a little timid lamb stepped out and bleated, "Ah, King Lion, it would be very sad if all the animals should lose their Christmas tree, for the very thought of that tree has brought us closer together, and here we were, wild and tame, fierce and timid, met together as friends. And oh, King Lion, rather than there should not be a tree, they may take me and hang me on it. Let them not take the turkeys and gazelles and the calves and the rabbits and all the rest that they have chosen. Let the tigers and leopards and wolves and foxes and eagles and hawks and owls and all their kind be content that their Christmas present shall be a lamb, and so we may come together again and have our happy Christmas tree, and each have what he wishes." "But," said the Lion, "what will you have? If you give yourself, then you will have no Christmas present." "Yes," said the Lamb, "I too shall have what I want, for I shall have brought them all together again and made each one happy." Then a dove fluttered down from a tree and landed on the ground beside the Lamb, and very timidly and softly she cooed, "Take me too, King Lion, as the present for the owls and the hawks and the weasels and the minks, because for them a lamb is too big. I am the best present for them. Take me, King Lion." Then the Lion roared, "See what the lamb and the dove have done! My food, O tigers and leopards and wolves and eagles and all your kind, is like your food, but I would rather eat nothing from our Christmas tree than take this lamb or this dove for my present." Then all the beasts kept still, because the Lion roared so loud and angrily, and the birds that were flying away settled on the branches of the trees, and the gazelles stopped their running and turned their heads to listen, and the rabbits peeped out through the grass and brush where they had hid. Then the Lion turned to the pig and roared, "See this lamb and this dove? Are you not ashamed for what you've done? You have spoiled all our happiness. Will you take back your choice, you pig, or do you wish to ruin our Christmas tree?" "Grunt, grunt," said the pig, "it is my right. I want something good. I don't care for your lambs and your doves. I want my swill." Then the Lion roared again, "Have all chosen?" And all answered, "Yes." "Then," said the Lion, "it is my choice." And all said, "It is." "I love fat and tender pigs. I choose a pig for my Christmas gift," roared the Lion. Did you ever hear a pig squeal? Oh, how that pig squealed then! And he got up on his fat little legs and tried to run away. But all the animals gathered round in a ring, and the hyenas laughed, and the jackals cried, and the dogs and the wolves and the foxes headed him off and hunted the poor pig back again. Then, when the pig found that he could not run away, he lay down on his back with his feet in the air and squealed with all his might, "Oh, I don't want this will! Oh, I don't want this will! I take it back! I don't want anything!" But at first no one heard him, because all were talking at once in their own way, barking and growling and roaring and chattering. But by and by the Lion saw that the pig was squealing something, so he roared for silence, and then they all heard the pig squeal out that he did not want any swill. And the Lion roared aloud, "You have heard? Has the Owl recorded that the pig will have no swill?" "Yes," said the Owl. "Then," said the Lion, "record that the Lion wants no pig." Then the Tiger growled, "And I want no calf." And one by one the Leopard and the Eagle, the Wolf and the Fox, the Hawk and the Owl, all their kind, took back their votes. And so it came about that the animals did have a Christmas tree after all. But instead of hanging lambs and doves upon the tree, they agreed that they could hang little images of lambs and doves, and other birds and animals too, perhaps. And by the custom spread until the humans came to hang the same little images on their trees too, and when you see a little figure of a lamb or a dove on the Christmas tree, you may know that it is all because the lamb and the dove, by their unselfishness, saved the animals from strife, for neither thought what he wanted from the tree, but each was ready to give himself for the others, so that they might not fight and kill one another at the Christmas time. Was it not cruel of the wolves and tigers and leopards and foxes to wish to eat the doves and sheep and rabbits and hares? But after all, the worst one of the lot, I think, was the pig. For the pig began the trouble, because he only thought of what Mr. Pig wanted for himself. And do you know, I think that after all, that is the trouble everywhere. We can get along all right if the pig will only keep away, for when the pig comes and begins to think what he can get for himself, without thinking of the pleasure and the comfort of anyone else, why then the fun is all spoiled, and pretty soon all sorts of bad tempers and bad passions are let loose. End of Part 6. Part 7 of A Christmas Miscellany 2023 by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 7, The Worker in Sandalwood by Marjorie Lowry Christie Pickthall. I like to think of this as a true story, but you who read may please yourselves, siding either with the curé, who says Hyacinth dreamed it all and did the carving himself in his sleep, or with Madame. I am sure that Hyacinth thinks it true, and so does Madame, but then she has the cabinet with the little birds and the lilies carved at the corners. Monsieur le curé shrugs his patient shoulders, but then he is tainted with the infidelities of cities, good man, having been 3 times to Montreal, and once in an electric car to St. Anne. He and Madame still talk it over whenever they meet, though it happened so many years ago, and each leaves the other forever unconvinced. Meanwhile, the dust gathers in the infinite fine lines of the little bird's feathers and softens the lily stamens where Madame's duster may not go, and the wood, aging, takes on a golden gleam as of immemorial sunsets, that pale red wood, heavy with the scent of the ancient East, the wood that Hyacinth loved. It was the only wood of that kind which had ever been seen in Terminaison. Pierre Lorillard brought it into the workshop one morning, a small, heavy bundle wrapped in sacking, and then in burlap, and then in fine, soft cloths. He laid it on a pile of shavings and unwrapped it carefully, and a dim sweetness filled the dark shed and hung heavily in the thin winter sunbeams. Pierre Lorillard rubbed the wood respectfully with his knobby fingers. "It is sandalwood," he explained to Hyacinth, pride of knowledge making him expansive, "a most precious wood that grows in warm countries, thou great goblin. Smell it, imbecile. It is sweeter than cedar. It is to make a cabinet for the old Madame at the big house. Thy great hands shall smooth the wood. Nigaud and I, Pierre the cabinet maker, shall render it beautiful." Then he went out, locking the door behind him. When he was gone, Hyacinth laid down his plane, blew on his stiff fingers, and shambled slowly over to the wood. He was a great clumsy boy of 14, dark-faced, very slow of speech, dull-eyed and uncared for. He was clumsy because it is impossible to move gracefully when you are growing very big and fast on quite insufficient food. He was dull-eyed because all eyes met his unlovingly. Uncared for because none knew the beauty of his soul. But his heavy young hands could carve simple things like flowers and birds and beasts to perfection, as the curé pointed out. Simon has a tobacco jar carved with pine cones and squirrels, and the curé has a pipe whose bowl is the bloom of a moccasin flower that I have seen. But it is all very long ago, and facts in those lonely villages easily become transfigured, touched upon their gray with a golden gleam. "Thy hand shall smooth the wood, Nigaud, and I shall render it beautiful," said Pierre Lorillard, and went off to drink brandy at the Cinque Chateau. Hyacinth knew that the making of the cabinet would fall to him, as most of the other work did. He also touched the strange, sweet wood, and at last laid his cheek against it, while the fragrance caught his breath. "How it is beautiful!" said Hyacinth, and for a moment his eyes glowed and he was happy. Then the light passed, and with bent head he shuffled back to his bench through a foam of white shavings curling almost to his knees. "Madame perhaps will want the cabinet next week, for that is Christmas," said Hyacinth, and fell to work harder than ever, though it was so cold in the shed that his breath hung like a little silver cloud, and the steel stung his hands. There was a tiny window to the right through which, when it was clear of frost, one looked on Terminaison, and that was cheerful and made one whistle. But to the left, through the chink of the ill-fitting door, there was nothing but the forest, and the road dying away in it, and the trees moving heavily under the snow. Yet from there came all Hyacinth's dumb dreams and slow, reluctant fancies, which he sometimes found himself able to tell, in wood, not in words. Brandy was good at the Cinque Chateau, and Pierre Lorillard gave Hyacinth plenty of directions, but no further help with the cabinet. "That is to be finished for Madame on the festival Gros Escargot," said he, cuffing Hyacinth's ears furiously. "Finished, and with a prettiness about the corners, hearest thou, Orson? I suffer from a delicacy of the constitution and a little feebleness in the legs on these days, so that I cannot handle the tools. I must leave this work to thee, Gaucher. See it is done properly, and stand up and touch a hand to thy cap when I address thee, Orvette, great slow worm." "Yes, monsieur," said Hyacinth, wearily. It is hard, when you do all the work, to be cuffed into the bargain, and 14 is not very old. He went to work on the cabinet with slow, exquisite skill. But on the eve of Noël he was still at work, and the cabinet unfinished. It meant a thrashing from Pierre if the morrow came and found it still unfinished, and Pierre's thrashings were cruel. But it was growing into a thing of perfection under his slow hands, and Hyacinth would not hurry over it. "Then work on it all night, and show it to me all completed in the morning, or thy bones shall mourn thine idleness," said Pierre with a flicker of his little eyes. And he shut Hyacinth into the workshop with a smoky lamp, his tools, and the sandalwood cabinet. It was nothing unusual. The boy had often been left before to finish a piece of work overnight while Pierre went off to his brandies. But this was Christmas Eve, and he was very tired. The cold crept into the shed until even the scent of the sandalwood could not make him dream himself warm, and the roof cracked sullenly in the frost. There came upon Hyacinth one of those awful, hopeless despairs that children know. I cannot endure to think of Hyacinth, poor lad, shut up, despairing in the workshop with his loneliness, his cold, and his hunger on the eve of Christmas. He was but an overgrown, unhappy child, and for unhappy children, no aid at this season seems too divine for faith. So Madame says, and she is very old and very wise. Hyacinth even looked at the chisel in his hand and thought that by a touch of that he might lose it all, and be at peace somewhere not far from God, only it was forbidden. Then came the tears and great sobs that sickened and deafened him, so that he scarcely heard the gentle rattling of the latch. At least, I suppose it came then, but it may have been later. The story is all so vague here, so confused with fancies that have spoiled the first simplicity. I think that Hyacinth must have gone to the door, opening it upon the still woods and the frosty stars, and that the lad who stood outside in the snow must have said, "I see you are working late, comrade. May I come in?" or something like it. Hyacinth brushed his ragged sleeve across his eyes and opened the door wider with a little nod to the other to enter. Those little lonely villages strung along the great river see strange wayfarers adrift inland from the sea. Hyacinth said to himself that surely here was such a one. Afterwards he told the curé that for a moment he had been bewildered. Dully blinking into the stranger's eyes, he lost for a flash the first impression of youth, and received one of some incredible age or sadness. But this also passed, and he knew that the wanderer's eyes were only quiet, like the little pools in the wood where the wild does went to drink. As he turned within the door, smiling at Hyacinth and shaking some snow from his fur cap, he did not seem more than 16 or so. "It is very cold outside," he said. "There is a big oak tree on the edge of the fields that has split in the frost and frightened all the little squirrels asleep there. Next year it will make an even better home for them, and see what I found close by." He opened his fingers and showed Hyacinth a little sparrow lying unruffled in the palm. "Pauvrette," said the dull Hyacinth. "Pauvrette, is it then dead?" He touched it with a gentle forefinger. "No," answered the strange boy, "it is not dead. We will put it here among the shavings, not far from the lamp, and it will be well by morning." He smiled at Hyacinth again, and the shambling lad felt dimly as if the scent of the sandalwood had deepened, and the lamp flame burned clearer. But the stranger's eyes were only quiet. "Have you come far?" asked Hyacinth. "It is a bad season for traveling, and the wolves are out in the woods." "A long way," said the other, "a long, long way. I heard a child cry." "There is no child here," answered Hyacinth, shaking his head. "Monsieur l'Oread is not fond of children. He says they cost too much money. But if you have come far, you must be cold and hungry, and I have no food nor fire. At the Saint Château you will find both." The stranger looked at him again with those quiet eyes, and Hyacinth fancied his face was familiar. "I will stay here," he said. "You are very late at work, and you are unhappy." "Why, as to that," answered Hyacinth, rubbing again at his cheeks and ashamed of his tears, "most of us are sad at one time or another, the good God knows. Stay here and welcome if it pleases you, and you may take a share of my bed, though it is no more than a pile of balsam boughs and an old blanket in the loft. But I must work at this cabinet, for the drawer must be finished, and handles put on, and these corners carved, all by the holy morning, or my wages will be paid with a stick." "You have a hard master," put in the other boy, "if he would pay you with blows upon the feast of Noel." "He is hard enough," said Hyacinth, "but once he gave me a dinner of sausages and white wine, and once in the summer melons. If my eyes will stay open, I will finish this by morning, but indeed I am sleepy. Stay with me an hour or so, comrade, and talk to me of your wanderings, so that the time may pass more quickly." "I will tell you of the country where I was a child," answered the stranger. And while Hyacinth worked, he told of sunshine and dust, of the shadow of vine leaves on the flat white walls of a house, of rosy doves on the flat roof, of the flowers that come out in the spring, crimson and blue, and the white cyclamen in the shadow of the rocks of the olive, the myrtle and almond, until Hyacinth's slow fingers ceased working and his sleepy eyes blinked wonderingly. "See what you have done, comrade," he said at last. "You have told of such pretty things that I have done no work for an hour. And now the cabinet will never be finished, and I shall be beaten." "Let me help you," smiled the other. "I also was bred a carpenter." At first Hyacinth would not, fearing to trust the sweet wood out of his own hands. But at length he allowed the stranger to fit in one of the little drawers, and so deftly was the work done that Hyacinth pounded his fists on the bench in admiration. "You have a pretty knack," he cried. "It seems as if you did but hold the drawer in your hands a moment, and hey-oh, it jumped into its place." "Oh, let me fit in the other little drawers while you go and rest a while," said the wanderer. So Hyacinth curled up among the shavings, and the stranger fell to work upon the little cabinet of sandalwood. Here begins what the curé will have. It is a dream within a dream, sweetest of dreams that has ever been dreamed, if that is so. Sometimes I am forced to think with him, but again I see as clearly as with old Madame's eyes that have not seen the earthly light for 20 years, and with her and Hyacinth I say, Credo. Hyacinth said that he lay among the shavings in the sweetness of the sandalwood and was very tired. He thought of the country where the stranger had been a boy, of the flowers on the hills, of the laughing leaves of aspen and poplar, of the golden flowering anise and the golden sun upon the dusty roads, until he was warm. All the time through these pictures, as through a painted veil, he was aware of that other boy with the quiet eyes, at work upon the cabinet, smoothing, fitting, polishing. "He does better work than I," thought Hyacinth, but he was not jealous. And again he thought, "It is growing towards morning. In a little while I will get up and help him." But he did not, for the dream of warmth and the smell of the sandalwood held him in a sweet drowse. Also he said that he thought the stranger was singing as he worked, for there seemed to be a sense of some music in the shed, though he could not tell whether it came from the other boy's lips or from the shabby old tools as he used them, or from the stars. He lay without moving, and behind the forest there shone a pale glow of some indescribable color that was neither green nor blue, while in Terminaison the church bells began to ring. Day will soon be here, thought Hyacinth, immovable in that deep dream of his, and with that day will come Monsieur Laureade and his stick. I must get up and help, for even yet the corners are not carved. But he did not get up. Instead, he saw the stranger look at him again, smiling as if he loved him, and lay his brown finger lightly upon the 4 empty corners of the cabinet. And Hyacinth saw the little squares of reddish wood ripple and heave and break, as little clouds when the wind goes through the sky. And out of them thrust forth the little birds, and after them the lilies, for a moment living, but even while Hyacinth looked, growing hard and reddish-brown and settling back into the sweet wood. Then the stranger smiled again, and laid all the tools neatly in order, and opening the door quietly, went away into the woods. Hyacinth lay still among the shavings for a long time, and then he crept slowly to the door. The sun, not yet risen, sent his first beams upon the delicate mists of frost afloat beneath the trees, and so all the world was aflame with splendid gold. Far away down the road a dim figure seemed to move amid the glory, but the glow and the splendor were such that Hyacinth was blinded. His breath came sharply as the glow beat in great waves on the wretched shed, on the foam of shavings, on the cabinet with the little birds and the lilies carved at the corners. He was too pure of heart to feel afraid. "But blessed be the Lord," whispered Hyacinth, clasping his slow hands, "for he hath visited and redeemed his people. But who will believe?" Then the sun of Christ's day rose gloriously, and the little sparrow came from his nest among the shavings and shook his wings to the light. End of Part 7. Part 8 of A Christmas Miscellany 2023 by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 8, The Lost Word, A Christmas Legend of Long Ago by Henry Van Dyke. 1. The Poverty of Hermas. Come down, Hermas, come down. The night is past. It is time to be stirring. Christ is born today. Peace be with you in his name. Make haste and come down. A little group of young men were standing in a street of Antioch in the dusk of early morning, 1500 years ago. It was a class of candidates who had nearly finished their 2 years of training for the Christian church. They had come to call their fellow student Hermas from his lodging. Their voices rang out cheerily through the cool air. They were full of that glad sense of life which the young feel when they awake and come to rouse one who is still sleeping. There was a note of friendly triumph in their call, as if they were exulting unconsciously in having begun the adventure of the new day before their comrade. But Hermas was not asleep. He had been waking for hours, and the dark walls of his narrow lodging had been a prison to his restless heart. A nameless sorrow and discontent had fallen upon him, and he could find no escape from the heaviness of his own thoughts. There is a sadness of youth into which the old cannot enter. It seems to them unreal and causeless, but it is even more bitter and burdensome than the sadness of age. There is a sting of resentment in it, a fever of angry surprise that the world should so soon be a disappointment, and life so early take on the look of a failure. It has little reason in it, perhaps, but it has all the more weariness and gloom, because the man who is oppressed by it feels dimly that it is an unnatural and an unreasonable thing, that he should be separated from the joy of his companions, and tired of living before he has fairly begun to live. Hermas had fallen into the very depths of this strange self-pity. He was out of tune with everything around him. He had been thinking, through the dead, still night, of all that he had given up when he left the house of his father, the wealthy pagan Demetrius, to join the company of the Christians. Only 2 years ago he had been one of the richest young men in Antioch. Now he was one of the poorest. And the worst of it was that, though he had made the choice willingly and accepted the sacrifice with a kind of enthusiasm, he was already dissatisfied with it. The new life was no happier than the old. He was weary of vigils and fasts, weary of studies and penances, weary of prayers and sermons. He felt like a slave in a treadmill. He knew that he must go on. His honor, his conscience, his sense of duty bound him. He could not go back to the old careless pagan life again, for something had happened within him which made a return impossible. Doubtless he had found the true religion, but he had found it only as a task and a burden. Its joy and peace had slipped away from him. He felt disillusioned and robbed. He sat beside his hard little couch, waiting without expectancy for the gray dawn of another empty day, and hardly lifting his head at the shouts of his friends. "Come down, Hermas, you sluggard, come down. It is Christmas morn. Awake and be glad with us." "I'm coming," he answered listlessly. "Only have patience a moment. I have been awake since midnight and waiting for the day." "You hear him," said his friends one to another. "How he puts us all to shame. He is more watchful, more eager than any of us. Our master, John the Presbyter, does well to be proud of him. He is the best man in our class. When he is baptized, the church will get a strong member." While they were talking, the door opened, and Hermas stepped out. He was a figure to be remarked in any company. Tall, broad-shouldered, straight-hipped, with a head proudly poised on the firm column of the neck, and short brown curls clustering over the square forehead. It was the perpetual type of vigorous and intelligent young manhood, such as may be found in every century among the throngs of ordinary men, as if to show what the flower of the race should be. But the light in his dark blue eyes was clouded and uncertain. His smooth cheeks were leaner than they should have been at 20, and there were downward lines about his mouth which spoke of desires unsatisfied and ambitions repressed. He joined his companions with brief greetings, a nod to one, a word to another, and they passed together down the steep street. Overhead, the mystery of daybreak was silently transfiguring the sky. The curtain of darkness had lifted softly upward along the edge of the horizon. The ragged crests of Mount Silpius were outlined with pale rosy light. In the central vault of heaven, a few large stars twinkled drowsily. The great city, still chiefly pagan, lay more than half asleep. But multitudes of the Christians, dressed in white and carrying lighted torches in their hands, were hurrying towards the Basilica of Constantine to keep the latest holy day of the Church, the new festival of the birthday of their Master. The vast bare building was soon crowded, and the younger converts, who were not yet permitted to stand among the baptized, found it difficult to come to their appointed place between the first two pillars of the house, just within the threshold. There was some good-humored pressing and jostling about the door, but the candidates pushed steadily forward. "By your leave, friends, our station is beyond you. Will you let us pass? Many thanks." A touch here, a courteous nod there, a little patience, a little persistence, and at last they stood in their place. Hermas was taller than his companions. He could look easily over their heads and survey the white sea of people stretching away through the columns under the shadows of the high roof, as the tide spreads on a calm day into the pillared cavern of Staffa, quiet as if the ocean hardly dared to breathe. The light of many flambeaux fell, in flickering, uncertain rays, over the assembly. At the end of the vista there was a circle of clearer, steadier radiance. Hermas could see the bishop in his great chair, surrounded by the presbyters, the lofty desks on either side for the readers of the Scripture, the communion table, and the table of offerings in the middle of the church. The call to prayer sounded down the long aisle. Thousands of hands were joyously lifted in the air, as if the sea had blossomed into waving lilies, and the Amen was like a murmur of countless ripples in an echoing place. Then the singing began, led by the choir of 100 trained voices which the Bishop Paul had founded in Antioch. Timidly, at first, the music felt its way, as the people joined with a broken and uncertain cadence the mingling of many little waves not yet gathered into rhythm and harmony. Soon the longer, stronger billows of song rolled in, sweeping from side to side, as the men and the women answered in the clear antiphony. Hermas had often been carried on those tides of music's golden seas setting toward eternity. But today his heart was a rock that stood motionless. The flood passed by and left him unmoved. Looking out from his place at the foot of the pillar, he saw a man standing far off in the lofty bema. Short and slender, wasted by sickness, gray before his time, with pale cheeks and wrinkled brow, he seemed at first like a person of no significance, a reed shaken in the wind. But there was a look in his deep-set, poignant eyes, as he gathered all the glances of the multitude to himself, that belied his mean appearance and prophesied power. Hermas knew very well who it was, the man who had drawn him from his father's house, the teacher who was instructing him as a son in the Christian faith, the guide and trainer of his soul, John of Antioch, whose fame filled the city and began to overflow Asia, and who was called already Chrysostom, the golden-mouthed preacher. Hermas had felt the magic of his eloquence many a time, And today, as the tense voice vibrated through the stillness and the sentences moved onward, growing fuller and stronger, bearing argosies of costly rhetoric and treasures of homely speech in their bosom, and drawing the hearts of men with a restless magic, Hermas knew that the preacher had never been more potent, more inspired. He played on that immense congregation as a master on an instrument. He rebuked their sins, and they trembled. He touched their sorrows, and they wept. He spoke of the conflicts, the triumphs, the glories of their faith, and they broke out in thunders of applause. He hushed them into reverent silence, and led them tenderly, with the wise men of the East, to the lowly birthplace of Jesus. Do thou, therefore, likewise leave the Jewish people, the troubled city, the bloodthirsty tyrant, the pomp of the world, and hasten to Bethlehem, the sweet house of spiritual bread. For though thou be but a shepherd, and come hither, thou shalt behold the young child in an inn. Though thou be a king, and come not hither, thy purple robe shall profit thee nothing. Though thou be one of the wise men, this shall be no hindrance to thee. Only let thy coming be to honor and adore, with trembling joy, the Son of God, to whose name be glory on this his birthday, and forever and forever. The soul of Hermas did not answer to the musician's touch. The strings of his heart were slack and soundless. There was no response within him. He was neither shepherd, nor king, nor wise man, only an unhappy, dissatisfied, questioning youth. He was out of sympathy with the eager preacher, the joyous hearers. In their harmony he had no part. Was it for this that he had forsaken his inheritance and narrowed his life to poverty and hardship? What was it all worth? The gracious prayers with which the young converts were blessed and dismissed before the sacrament sounded hollow in his ears. Never had he felt so utterly alone as in that praying throng. He went out with his companions like a man departing from a banquet where all but he had been fed. "Farewell, Hermas," they cried as he turned from them at the door. But he did not look back nor wave his hand. He was alone already in his heart. When he entered the broad avenue of the colonnades, the sun had already topped the eastern hills, and the ruddy light was streaming through the long double row of archways and over the pavements of crimson marble. But Hermas turned his back to the morning, and walked with his shadow before him. The street began to swarm and whirl and quiver with the motley life of a huge city. Beggars and jugglers, dancers and musicians, gilded youths in their chariots, and daughters of joy looking out from their windows, all intoxicated with the mere delight of living and the gladness of a new day. The pagan populace of Antioch, reckless, pleasure-loving, spendthrift, were preparing for the Saturnalia. But all this Hermas had renounced. He cleft his way through the crowd slowly, like a reluctant swimmer weary of breasting the tide. At the corner of the street, where the narrow populous lane of the camel-drivers crossed the colonnades, a storyteller had bewitched a circle of people around him. It was the same old tale of love and adventure that many generations have listened to, but the lively fancy of the hearers lent it new interest, and the wit of the improviser drew forth sighs of interest and shouts of laughter. A yellow-haired girl on the edge of the throng turned as Hermes passed and smiled in his face. She put out her hand and caught him by the sleeve. "Stay," she said, "and laugh a bit with us. I know who you are, the son of Demetrius. You must have bags of gold. Why do you look so black? Love is alive yet." Hermas shook off her hand, but not ungently. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "You are mistaken in me. I am poorer than you are." But as he passed on, he felt the warm touch of her fingers through the cloth on his arm. It seemed as if she had plucked him by the heart. He went out by the western gate, under the golden cherubim that the Emperor Titus had stolen from the ruined temple of Jerusalem and fixed upon the Arch of Triumph. He turned to the left and climbed the hill to the road that led to the Grove of Daphne. In all the world there was no other highway as beautiful. It wound for 5 miles along the foot of the mountains, among gardens and villas, plantations of myrtles and mulberries, with wide outlooks over the valley of Orontes and the distant shimmering sea. The richest of all the dwellings was the house of the Golden Pillars, the mansion of Demetrius. He had won the favor of the apostate emperor Julian, whose vain efforts to restore the worship of the heathen gods some 20 years ago had opened an easy way to wealth and power for all who would mock and oppose Christianity. Demetrius was not a sincere fanatic like his royal master, but he was bitter enough in his professed scorn of the new religion to make him a favorite at the court where the old religion was in fashion. He had reaped a rich reward of his policy, and a strange sense of consistency made him more fiercely loyal to it than if it had been a real faith. He was proud of being called the friend of Julian, and when his son joined himself to the Christians and acknowledged the unseen God, it seemed like an insult to his father's success. He drove the boy from his door and disinherited him. The glittering portico of the serene, haughty house, the repose of the well-ordered garden, still blooming with belated flowers, seemed at once to deride and to invite the young outcast plodding along the dusty road. "This is your birthright," whispered the clambering rose-trees by the gate, and the closed portals of carven bronze said, "You have sold it for a thought, a dream." 2. A Christmas Loss. Hermes found the Grove of Daphne quite deserted. There was no sound in the enchanted vale but the rustling of the light winds chasing each other through the laurel thickets, and the babble of innumerable streams. Memories of the days and nights of delicate pleasure that the grove had often seen still haunted the bewildered paths and broken fountains. At the foot of a rocky eminence, crowned with the ruins of Apollo's temple, which had been mysteriously destroyed by fire just after Julian had restored and reconsecrated it, Hermes sat down beside a gushing spring and gave himself up to sadness. How beautiful the world would be, how joyful, how easy to live in, without religion! These questions about unseen things, perhaps about unreal things, these restraints and duties and sacrifices, if I were only free from them all, and could only forget them all, then I could live my life as I pleased and be happy. "Why not?" said a quiet voice at his back. He turned and saw an old man with a long beard and a threadbare cloak, the garb affected by the pagan philosophers, standing behind him and smiling curiously. "How is it that you answer that which has not been spoken?" said Hermes, "and who are you that honor me with your company?" "Forgive the intrusion," answered the stranger. "It is not ill meant. A friendly interest is as good as an introduction. But to what singular circumstance do I owe this interest?" "To your face," said the old man, with a courteous inclination. "Perhaps also a little to the fact that I am the oldest inhabitant here, and feel as if all visitors were my guests, in a way." "Are you, then, one of the keepers of the grove? And have you given up your work with the trees to take a holiday as a philosopher?" "Not at all. The robe of philosophy is a mere affectation, I must confess. I think little of it. My profession is the care of altars. In fact, I am that solitary priest of Apollo whom the Emperor Julian found here when he came to revive the worship of the grove some 20 years ago. You have heard of the incident?" "Yes," said Hermes, beginning to be interested. "The whole city must have heard of it, for it is still talked of. But surely it was a strange sacrifice that you brought to celebrate the restoration of Apollo's temple?" "You mean the goose? Well, perhaps it was not precisely what the emperor expected, but it was all that I had, and it seemed to me not inappropriate. You will agree to that if you are a Christian, as I guess from your dress." "You speak lightly for a priest of Apollo." "Oh, as for that, I am no bigot. The priesthood is a professional matter, and the name of Apollo is as good as any other. How many altars do you think there have been in this grove?" "I do not know." "Just 24, including that of the martyr Babylas, whose ruined chapel you see just beyond us. I have had something to do with most of them in my time. They are transitory. They give employment to caretakers for a while. But the thing that lasts, and the thing that interests me, is the human life that plays around them. The game has been going on for centuries. It still disports itself very pleasantly on summer evenings through these shady walks. Believe me, for I know. Daphne and Apollo were shadows, but the flying maidens and the pursuing lovers, the music and the dances, these are the realities. Life is the game, and the world keeps it up merrily. But you are of a sad countenance for one so young and so fair. Are you a loser in the game?" The words and tone of the speaker fitted Hermas' mood as a key fits the lock. He opened his heart to the old man and told him the story of his life, his luxurious boyhood in his father's house, the irresistible spell which compelled him to forsake it when he heard John's preaching of the new religion, his lonely year with the anchorites among the mountains, the strict discipline in his teacher's house at Antioch, his weariness of duty, his distaste for poverty, his discontent with worship. "And today," said he, "I have been thinking that I am a fool. My life is swept as bare as a hermit's cell. There is nothing in it but a dream, a thought of God, which does not satisfy me." The singular smile deepened on his companion's face. "You are ready, then," he suggested, "to renounce your new religion and go back to that of your father?" "No, I renounce nothing. I accept nothing. I do not wish to think about it. I only wish to live." "A very reasonable wish, and I think you are about to see its accomplishment. Indeed, I may even say that I can put you in the way of securing it. Do you believe in magic?" "I have told you already that I do not know whether I believe in anything. This is not a day on which I care to make professions of faith. I believe in what I see. I want what will give me pleasure." "Well," said the old man soothingly, as he plucked a leaf from the laurel tree above them and dipped it in the spring, "let us dismiss the riddles of belief. I like them as little as you do. You know, this is a Castilian fountain. The Emperor Hadrian once read his fortune here from a leaf dipped in the water. Let us see what this leaf tells us. It is already turning yellow. How do you read that?" "Wealth," said Hermas, laughing, as he looked at his mean garments. "And here is a bud on the stem that seems to be swelling. What is that?" "Pleasure," answered Hermas bitterly. "And here is a tracing of wreaths upon the surface. What do you make of that?" "What you will," said Hermas, not even taking the trouble to look. "Suppose we say success and fame?" "Yes," said the stranger, "it is all written here. I promise that you shall enjoy it all. But you do not need to believe in my promise. I am not in the habit of requiring faith of those whom I would serve. No such hard conditions for me. There is only one thing that I ask. This is the season that you Christians call the Christmas, and you have taken up the pagan custom of exchanging gifts. Well, if I give to you, you must give to me. It is a small thing, and really the thing you can best afford to part with. A single word, the name of him you profess to worship. Let me take that word and all that belongs to it entirely out of your life, so that you shall never need to hear it or speak it again. You will be richer without it. I promise you everything, and this is all I ask in return. Do you consent?" "Yes, I consent," said Hermas, mocking. "If you take your price, a word, you can keep your promise, a dream." The stranger laid the long, cool, wet leaf softly across the young man's eyes. An icicle of pain darted through them. Every nerve in his body was drawn together there in a knot of agony. Then all the tangle of pain seemed to be lifted out of him, a cool languor of delight flowed back through every vein, and he sank into a profound sleep. 3. Parting, but no farewell. There is a slumber so deep that it annihilates time. It is like a fragment of eternity. Beneath its enchantment of vacancy, a day seems like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years might well pass as one day. It was such a sleep that fell upon Hermas in the grove of Daphne, an immeasurable period, an interval of life so blank and empty that he could not tell whether it was long or short, had passed over him when his senses began to stir again. The setting sun was shooting arrows of gold under the glossy laurel leaves. He rose and stretched his arms, grasping a smooth branch above him and shaking it to make sure that he was alive. Then he hurried back toward Antioch, treading lightly as if on air. The ground seemed to spring beneath his feet. Already his life had changed, he knew not how. Something that did not belong to him had dropped away. He had returned to a former state of being. He felt as if anything might happen to him, and he was ready for anything. He was a new man, yet curiously familiar to himself, as if he had done with playing a tiresome part and returned to his natural state. He was buoyant and free, without a care, a doubt, a fear. As he drew near to his father's house, he saw a confusion of servants in the porch, and the old steward ran down to meet him at the gate. "Lord, we have been seeking you everywhere. The master is at the point of death, and has sent for you. Since the 6th hour he calls your name continually. Come to him quickly, Lord, for I fear the time is short." Hermas entered the house at once. Nothing could amaze him today. His father lay on an ivory couch in the inmost chamber, with shrunken face and restless eyes, his lean fingers picking incessantly at the silken coverlet. "My son," he murmured, "Hermas, my son, it is good that you have come back to me. I have missed you. I was wrong to send you away. You shall never leave me again. You are my son, my heir. I have changed everything. Hermas, my son, come nearer, close beside me. Take my hand, my son." The young man obeyed, and kneeling by the couch, gathered his father's cold, twitching fingers in his firm, warm grasp. "Hermas, life is passing, long, rich, prosperous. The last sands, I cannot stay them. My religion, good policy. Julian was my friend, but now he is gone. Where? My soul is empty. Nothing beyond, very dark. I am afraid. But you know something better. You found something that made you willing to give up your life for it. It must have been almost like dying. Yet you were happy. What was it you found? See, I am giving you everything. I have forgiven you. Now forgive me. Tell me, what is it? Your secret, your faith. Give it to me before I go." At the sound of this broken pleading, a strange passion of pity and love took the young man by the throat. His voice shook a little as he answered eagerly, "Father, there is nothing to forgive. I am your son. I will gladly tell you all that I know. I will give you the secret of faith, Father. You must believe with all your heart and soul and strength in—" Where was the word? The word that he had been used to utter night and morning, the word that had meant to him more than he had ever known. What had become of it? He groped for it in the dark room of his mind. He had thought he could lay his hand upon it in a moment, but it was gone. Someone had taken it away. Everything else was most clear to him. The terror of death, the lonely soul appealing from his father's eyes, the instant need of comfort and help. But at the one point where he looked for help, he could find nothing, only an empty space. The word of hope had vanished. He felt for it blindly and in desperate haste. "Father, wait! I have forgotten something. It has slipped away from me. I shall find it in a moment. There is hope. I will tell you presently. Oh, wait!" The bony hand gripped his like a vice. The glazed eyes opened wider. "Tell me," whispered the old man. "Tell me quickly, for I must go." The voice sank into a dull rattle. The fingers closed once more and relaxed. The light behind the eyes went out. Hermes, the master of the House of the Golden Pillars, was keeping watch by the dead. 4. Love in Search of a Word. The break with the old life was as clean as if it had been cut with a knife. Some faint image of a hermit's cell, a bare lodging in a back street of Antioch, a classroom full of earnest students, remained in Irma's memory. Some dull echo of the voice of John the Presbyter, and the murmured sound of chanting, and the murmur of great congregations still lingered in his ears. But it was like something that had happened to another person, something that he had read long ago, but of which he had lost the meaning. His new life was full and smooth and rich, too rich for any sense of loss to make itself felt. There were 100 affairs to busy him, and the days ran swiftly by as if they were shod with winged sandals. Nothing needed to be considered, prepared for, begun. Everything was ready and waiting for him. All that he had to do was to go on with it. The estate of Demetrius was even greater than the world had supposed. There were fertile fields in Syria, which the emperor had given him, marble quarries in Phrygia, and forests of valuable timber in Cilicia. The vaults of the villa contained chests of gold and silver. The secret cabinets in the master's room were full of precious stones. The stewards were diligent and faithful. The servants of the magnificent household rejoiced at the young master's return. His table was spread. The rose garland of pleasure was woven for his head, and his cup was already filled with the spicy wine of power. The period of mourning for his father came at a fortunate moment to seclude and safeguard him from the storm of political troubles and persecutions that fell upon Antioch after the insults offered by the mob to the imperial statues in the year 887. The friends of Demetrius, prudent and conservative persons, gathered around Hermes and made him welcome to their circle. Chief among them was Libanius the Sophist, his nearest neighbor, whose daughter Athenes had been the playmate of Hermes in the old days. He had left her a child. He found her a beautiful woman. What transformation is so magical, so charming as this? To see the uncertain lines of youth rounded into firmness and symmetry, to discover the half-ripe, merry, changing face of the girl matured into perfect loveliness, and looking at you with calm, clear, serious eyes, not forgetting the past, but fully conscious of the changed present. This is to behold a miracle in the flesh. "Where have you been these last 2 years?" said Athenes, as they walked together through the garden of lilies where they had so often played. "In a land of tiresome dreams," answered Hermes, "but you have wakened me, and I am never going back again." It was not to be supposed that the sudden disappearance of Hermes from among his fellow associates could long remain unnoticed. At first it was a mystery. There was a fear, for 2 or 3 days, that he might be lost. Some of his more intimate companions maintained that his devotion had led him out into the desert to join the anchorites. But the news of his return to the House of the Golden Pillars, and of his new life as its master, filtered quickly through the gossip of the city. Then the church was filled with dismay and grief and reproach. Messengers and letters were sent to Hermes. They disturbed him a little, but they took no hold upon him. It seemed to him as if the messengers spoke in a strange language. As he read the letters, there were words blotted out of the writing which made the full sense unintelligible. His old companions came to reprove him for leaving them, to warn him of the peril of apostasy, to entreat him to return. It all sounded vague and futile. They spoke as if he had betrayed or offended someone. But when they came to name the object of his fear, the one whom he had displeased and to whom he should return, he heard nothing. There was a blur of silence in their speech. The clock pointed to the hour, but the bell did not strike. At last Hermas refused to see them any more. One day John the Presbyter stood in the atrium. Hermas was entertaining Libanius and Athanase in the banquet hall. When the visit of the presbyter was announced, the young master loosed a collar of gold and jewels from his neck and gave it to his scribe. "Take this to John of Antioch, and tell him it is a gift from his former pupil, as a token of remembrance, or to spend for the poor of the city. I will always send him what he wants, but it is idle for us to talk together any more. I do not understand what he says. I have not gone to the temple, nor offered sacrifice, nor denied his teaching. I have simply forgotten. I do not think about those things any longer. I am only living. A happy man wishes him all happiness and farewell." But John let the golden collar fall on the marble floor. "Tell your master that we shall talk together again after all," said he as he passed sadly out of the hall. The love of Athanase and Hermas was like a tiny rivulet that sinks out of sight in a cavern, but emerges again as a bright and brimming stream. The careless camaraderie of childhood was mysteriously changed into a complete companionship. When Athanase entered the house of the Golden Pillars as a bride, all the music of life came with her. Hermes called the feast of her welcome the banquet of the full chord. Day after day, night after night, week after week, month after month, the bliss of the home unfolded like a rose of 1,000 leaves. When a child came to them, a strong, beautiful boy, worthy to be the heir of such a house, the heart of the rose was filled with overflowing fragrance. Happiness was heaped upon happiness. Every wish brought its own accomplishment. Wealth, honor, beauty, peace, love. It was an abundance of felicity so great that the soul of Hermas could hardly contain it. Strangely enough, it began to press upon him, to trouble him with the very excess of joy. He felt as if there were something yet needed to complete and secure it all. There was an urgency within him, a longing to find some outlet for his feelings. He knew not how. Some expression and culmination of his happiness, he knew not what. Under his joyous demeanor a secret fire of restlessness began to burn, an expectancy of something yet to come, which should put the touch of perfection on his life. He spoke of it to Athanase as they sat together one summer evening in a bower of jasmine, with their boy playing at their feet. There had been music in the garden, but now the singers and lute players had withdrawn, leaving the master and mistress alone in the lingering twilight, tremulous with inarticulate melody of unseen birds. There was a secret voice in the hour seeking vainly for utterance, a word waiting to be spoken at the center of the charm. "How deep is our happiness, my beloved," said Hermas, "deeper than the sea that slumbers yonder, below the city. And yet I feel it is not quite full and perfect. There is a depth of joy that we have not yet known, a repose of happiness that is still beyond us. What is it? I have no superstitious fears, like the king who cast his signet ring into the sea because he dreaded that some secret vengeance would fall on his unbroken good fortune. That was an idle terror. But there is something that oppresses me like an invisible burden. There is something still undone, unspoken, unfelt, something that we need to complete everything. Have you not felt it too? Can you not lead me to it?" "Yes," she answered, lifting her eyes to his face. "I too have felt it, Hermas, this burden, this need, this unsatisfied longing. I think I know what it means. It is gratitude, the language of the heart, the music of happiness. There is no perfect joy without gratitude. But we have never learned it, and the want of it troubles us. It is like being dumb with a heart full of love. We must find the word for it and say it together. Then we shall be perfectly joined in perfect joy. Come, my dear Lord, let us take the boy with us and give thanks." Hermes lifted the child in his arms, and turned with Athenais into the depths of the garden. There was a dismantled shrine of some forgotten fashion of worship half hidden among the luxuriant flowers. A fallen image lay beside it, face downward in the grass. They stood there hand in hand, the boy drowsily resting on his father's shoulder, a threefold harmony of strength and beauty and innocence. Silently the roseate light caressed the tall spires of the cypress trees. Silently the shadows gathered at their feet. Silently the crystal stars looked out from the deepening arch of heaven. The very breath of being paused. It was the hour of culmination, the supreme moment of felicity, waiting for its crown. The tones of Hermes were clear and low as he began, half speaking and half chanting, in the rhythm of an ancient song. Fair is the world, the sea, the sky, the double kingdom of day and night, in the glow of morning, in the shadow of evening, and under the dripping light of stars. Fairer still is life in our breasts, and its manifold music and meaning, with its wonder of seeing and hearing and feeling and knowing and being. Fairer and still more fair is love that draws us together, mingles our lives in its flow, and bears them along like a river, strong and clear and swift, rejecting the stars in its bosom. Wide is our world, we are rich, we have all things. Life is abundant within us, a measureless deep. Deepest of all is our love, and it longs to speak. Come, thou final word, come, thou crown of speech, come, thou charm of peace, open the gates of our hearts, lift the weight of your joy and bear it upward. For all good gifts, for all perfect gifts, for love, for life, for the world, we praise, we bless, we thank. As a soaring bird, struck by an arrow, falls headlong from the sky, so the song of Hermes fell. At the end of his flight of gratitude there was nothing, a blank, a hollow space. He looked for a face and saw a void. He sought for a hand and clasped vacancy. His heart was throbbing and swelling with passion. The bell swung to and fro within him, beating from side to side as if it would burst, but not a single note came from it. All the fullness of his feeling that had risen upward like a living fountain fell back from the empty sky, as cold as snow, as hard as hail, frozen and dead. There was no meaning in his happiness. No one had sent it to him. There was no one to thank for it. His felicity was a closed circle, a wall of eternal ice. "Let us go back," he said sadly to Athenais. "The child is heavy upon my shoulder. We will lay him to sleep and go into the library. The air grows chilly. We were mistaken. The gratitude of life is only a dream. There is no one to thank." And in the garden it was already night. 5. Riches without rest. No outward change came to the house of the golden pillars. Everything moved as smoothly, as delicately, as prosperously as before. But inwardly there was a subtle, inexplicable transformation, a vague discontent, a final and inevitable sense of incompleteness overshadowed existence from that night when Hermes realized that his joy could never go beyond itself. The next morning the old man whom he had seen in the grove of Daphne, but never since, appeared mysteriously at the door of the house, as if he had been sent for, and entered to dwell there like an invited guest. Hermes could not but make him welcome, and at first he tried to regard him with reverence and affection as the one through whom fortune had come. But it was impossible. There was a chill in the inscrutable smile of Marcion, as he called himself, that seemed to mock at reverence. He was in the house as one watching a strange experiment, tranquil, interested, ready to supply anything that might be needed for its completion, but thoroughly indifferent to the feelings of the subject, an anatomist of life, looking curiously to see how long it would continue and how it would behave after the heart had been removed. In his presence, Hermes was conscious of a certain irritation, a resentful anger against the calm, frigid scrutiny of the eyes that followed him everywhere, like a pair of spies peering out over the smiling mouth and the long white beard. "Why do you look at me so curiously?" asked Hermes one morning, as they sat together in the library. "Do you see anything strange in me?" "No," answered Marcion, "something familiar." "And what is that?" "A singular likeness to a discontented young man that I met some years ago in the grove of Daphne." "But why should that interest you? Surely it was to be expected." "A thing that we expect often surprises us when we see it. Besides, my curiosity is piqued. I suspect you of keeping a secret from me." "You are jesting with me. There is nothing in my life that you do not know. What is the secret?" "Nothing more than the wish to have one. You are growing tired of your bargain. The game wearies you. That is foolishness. Do you want to try a new part?" The question was like a mirror upon which one comes suddenly in a half-lighted room. A quick illumination falls on it, and the passer-by is startled by the look of his own face. "You are right," said Hermas. "I am tired. We have been going on stupidly in this house, as if nothing were possible but what my father had done before me. There is nothing original in being rich and well-fed and well-dressed. Thousands of men have tried it, and have not been very well satisfied. Let us do something new. Let us make a mark in the world." "It is well said," nodded the old man. "You are speaking again like a man after my own heart. There is no folly but the loss of an opportunity to enjoy a new sensation." From that day Hermas seemed to be possessed with a perpetual haste, an uneasiness that left him no repose. The summit of life had been attained, the highest possible point of felicity. Henceforward the course could only be at a level, perhaps downward. It might be brief; at the best it could not be very long. It was madness to lose a day, an hour. That would be the only fatal mistake, to forfeit anything of the bargain that he had made. He would have it and hold it and enjoy it all to the full. The world might have nothing better to give than it had already given, but surely it had many things that were new to bestow upon him, and Marcion should help him to find them. Under his learned counsel, the House of the Golden Pillars took on a new magnificence. Artists were brought from Corinth and Rome and Byzantium to adorn it with splendor. Its fame glittered round the world. Banquets of incredible luxury drew the most celebrated guests into its triclinium, and filled them with envious admiration. The bees swarmed and buzzed about the golden hive. The human insects, glorious moths of pleasure and greedy flies of appetite, parasites and flatterers and crowds of inquisitive idlers, danced and fluttered in the dazzling light that surrounded Hermas. Everything that he touched prospered. He bought a tract of land in the Caucasus, and emeralds were discovered among the mountains. He sent a fleet of wheat ships to Italy, and the price of grain doubled while it was on the way. He sought political favor with the emperor, and was rewarded with the governorship of the city. His name was a word to conjure with. The beauty of Athenaeus lost nothing with the passing seasons, but grew more perfect, even under the inexplicable shade of dissatisfaction that sometimes veiled it as a translucent cloud that passes before the full moon. Fair as the wife of Hermas was a proverb in Antioch, and soon men began to add to it, beautiful as the son of Hermas, for the child developed swiftly in that favoring clime. At 9 years of age he was straight and strong, firm of limb and clear of eye. His brown head was on a level with his father's heart. He was the jewel of the House of the Golden Pillars, the pride of Hermes, the new Fortunatus. That year another drop of success fell into his brimming cup. His black Numidian horses, which he had been training for 3 years for the world-renowned chariot races of Antioch, won the victory over a score of rivals. Hermes received the prize carelessly from the judge's hands, and turned to drive once more round the circus, to show himself to the people. He lifted the eager boy into the chariot beside him to share his triumph. Here indeed was the glory of his life, this matchless sun, his brighter counterpart carved in breathing ivory, touching his arm and balancing himself proudly on the swaying floor of the chariot. As the horses pranced around the ring, a great shout of applause filled the amphitheater, and thousands of spectators waved their salutations of praise. "Hail, fortunate Hermes, master of success! Hail, little Hermes, prince of good luck!" The sudden tempest of acclamation, the swift fluttering of innumerable garments in the air, startled the horses. They dashed violently forward and plunged upon the bits. The left rein broke. They swerved to the right, swinging the chariot sideways with a grating noise, and dashing it against the stone parapet of the arena. In an instant the wheel was shattered, the axle struck the ground, and the chariot was dragged onward, rocking and staggering. By a strenuous effort, Hermes kept his place on the frail platform, clinging to the unbroken rein. But the boy was tossed lightly from his side at the first shock. His head struck the wall, and when Hermes turned to look for him, he was lying like a broken flower on the sand. 6. Great fear and recovered joy. They carried the boy in a litter to the house of the Golden Pillars, summoning the most skillful physician of Antioch to attend him. For hours the child was as quiet as death. Hermes watched the white eyelids, folded close like lily buds at night, even as one watches for the morning. At last they opened, but the fire of fever was burning in the eyes, and the lips were moving in a wild delirium. Hour after hour that sweet childish voice rang through the halls and chambers of the splendid, helpless house, now rising in shrill calls of distress and senseless laughter, now sinking in weariness and dull moaning. The stars waxed and waned, the sun rose and set, the roses bloomed and fell in the garden. The birds sang and slept among the jasmine bowers. But in the heart of Hermes there was no song, no bloom, no light, only speechless anguish and a certain fearful looking for of desolation. He was like a man in a nightmare. He saw the shapeless terror that was moving toward him, but he was impotent to stay or to escape it. He had done all that he could. There was nothing left but to wait. He paced to and fro, now hurrying to the boy's bed as if he could not bear to be away from it, now turning back as if he could not endure to be near it. The people of the house, even Athenaeus, feared to speak to him. There was something so vacant and desperate in his face. At nightfall, on the second of those eternal days, he shut himself in the library. The unfilled lamp had gone out, leaving a trail of smoke in the air. The sprigs of mignonette and rosemary with which the room was sprinkled every day were unrenewed, and scented the gloom with a close odor of decay. A costly manuscript of Theocritus was tumbled in disorder on the floor. Hermes sank into a chair like a man in whom the very spring of being is broken. Through the darkness someone drew near. He did not even lift his head. A hand touched him. A soft arm was laid over his shoulder. It was Athenaeus, kneeling beside him and speaking very low. "Hermes, it is almost over. The child. His voice grows weaker hour by hour. He moans and calls for someone to help him, and then he laughs. It breaks my heart. He has just fallen asleep. The moon is rising now. Unless a change comes, he cannot last till sunrise. Is there nothing we can do? Is there no power that can save him? Is there no one to pity us and spare us? Let us call, let us beg for compassion and help. Let us pray for his life." Yes, that was what he wanted. That was the only thing that could bring relief. To pray. To pour out his sorrow somewhere, to find a greater strength than his own, and cling to it and plead for mercy and help. To leave that undone was to be false to his manhood. It was to be no better than the dumb beasts when their young perish. How could he let his boy suffer and die without an effort, a cry, a prayer? He sank on his knees beside Athenaeus. Out of the depths we call for pity. The light of our eyes is fading. The child is dying. Oh, the child, the child! Spare the child's life, thou merciful! Not a word, only that deathly blank. The hands of Hermas, stretched out in supplication, touched the marble table. He felt the cool hardness of the polished stone beneath his fingers. A book, dislodged by his touch, fell rustling to the floor. Through the open door, faint and far off, came the footsteps of the servants, moving cautiously. The heart of Hermas was like a lump of ice in his bosom. He rose slowly to his feet, lifting Athenaeus with him. "It is in vain," he said. "There is nothing for us to do. Long ago I knew something. I think it would have helped us. But I have forgotten it. It is all gone. But I would give all that I have if I could bring it back again now, at this hour, in this time of our bitter trouble." A slave entered the room while he was speaking and approached hesitatingly. "Master," he said, "John of Antioch, whom we were forbidden to admit to the house, has come again. He would take no denial. Even now he waits in the peristyle, and the old man Marcion is with him, seeking to turn him away." "Come," said Hermas to his wife, "let us go to him, for I think I see the beginning of a way that may lead us out of this dreadful darkness." In the central hall the two men were standing, Marcion with disdainful eyes and sneering lips, taunting the unbidden guest to depart. John silent, quiet, patient, while the wondering slaves looked on in dismay. He lifted his searching gaze to the haggard face of Hermas. "My son, I knew that I should see you again, even though you did not send for me. I have come to you because I have heard that you are in trouble." "It is true," answered Hermas passionately. "We are in trouble, desperate trouble, trouble accursed. Our child is dying. We are poor, we are destitute, we are afflicted. In all this house, in all the world, there is no one that can help us. I knew something long ago when I was with you, a word, a name, in which we might have found hope. But I have lost it. I gave it to this man. He has taken it away from me forever." He pointed to Marcion. The old man's lips curled scornfully. "A word, a name," he sneered. "What is that, O most wise and holy presbyter? A thing of air, an unreal thing that men make to describe their own dreams and fancies. Who would go about to rob anyone of such a thing as that? It is a prize that only a fool would think of taking. Besides, the young man parted with it of his own free will. He bargained with me cleverly. I promised him wealth and pleasure and fame. What did he give in return? An empty name, which was a burden." "Servant of demons, be still!" The voice of John rang clear, like a trumpet, through the hall. "There is a name which none shall dare to take in vain. There is a name which none can lose without being lost. There is a name at which the devils tremble. Depart quickly before I speak it." Marcion had shrunk into the shadows of one of the pillars. A bright lamp near him tottered on its pedestal and fell with a crash. In the confusion he vanished as noiselessly as a shade. John turned to Hermas, and his tone softened as he said, "My son, you have sinned deeper than you know. The word with which you parted so lightly is the key word of all life and joy and peace. Without it the world has no meaning, and existence no rest, and death no refuge. It is the word that purifies love, and comforts grief, and keeps hope alive forever. It is the most precious thing that ever ear has heard, or mind has known, or heart has conceived. It is the name of Him who has given us life and breath and all things richly to enjoy. The name of Him who, though we may forget Him, never forgets us. the name of him who pities us as you pity your suffering child, the name of him who, though we wander far from him, seeks us in the wilderness, and sent his Son, even as his Son has sent me this night, to breathe again that forgotten name in the heart that is perishing without it. Listen, my son, listen with all your soul to the blessed name of God our Father. The cold agony in the breast of Hermas dissolved like a fragment of ice that melts in the summer sea. A sense of sweet release spread through him from head to foot. The lost was found. The dew of a divine peace fell on his parched soul, and the withering flower of human love lifted its head again. The light of a new hope shone on his face. He stood upright and lifted his hands high toward heaven. Out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord. O my God, be merciful to me, for my soul trusteth in thee. My God, thou hast given, take not thy gift away from me. O my God, spare the life of this my child. O thou God, my Father, my Father. A deep hush followed the cry. Listen, whispered Athenaeus breathlessly. Was it an echo? It could not be, for it came again. The voice of the child, clear and low, waking from sleep and calling, My Father, my Father. End of Part 8. Part 9 of A Christmas Miscellany 2023 by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 9, The Escape of Alice by Vincent Starrett. The red linen covers opened slightly, and a little girl slipped out, leaving behind her a curious vacancy in one of the familiar pictures signed with Mr. Tennille's initials. She looked about her with bright, alert eyes, hoping no one had been a witness to her desertion, and then carefully began to climb down. She need not have alarmed herself, for she was no bigger than a minute, and clearer eyes than those of the rheumatic old antiquarian who kept the shop would have been needed to comprehend her departure. Fortunately, the shelf onto which she had emerged was not high, and by exercising great caution, the little girl was able to reach the floor without mishap. Still watching the old man closely, she reached a hand into the pocket of her print dress and produced a few crumbs of cake, which she immediately ate. Almost instantly she began to grow, and in a moment, from a tiny little mite of 3 or 4 inches, she had shot up into as tall a schoolgirl of 13 as the proudest parent could wish. The ascent, indeed, was so rapid that before she quite realized what had happened, there was her head on a level with the shelf upon which, only an instant before, she had been standing. And there was the prison from which she had escaped. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, read the gold letters over the door. She plucked the volume from its place and advanced with it toward the guardian of the bookshop. If it is not too high, said Alice, I think I shall take this. The old bookseller, whose wits had been wool-gathering for many years, would not have admitted for worlds that he had not heard her enter the shop. He took the book from her hand. You choose wisely, he said, and patted the red covers lovingly. Alice, the ageless child. It is one of the greatest compendiums of wit and sense in literature. There are only 2 books to match it. You shall have it for 15 cents, for it is far from new, and I see what I had not noticed before, that the frontispiece is missing. And what are the other 2? Asked Alice eagerly. When you are older you will read them, said the old bookman. They are called Don Quixote and the Pickwick Papers. Then very suddenly Alice blushed, for she remembered that she could not pay. Timidly she handed back the red-covered volume. I am sorry, she said, but I have no money. I don't know why I was so stupid as to come away without any. Money! Cried the antiquarian. Did I ask you money for this book? Forgive me. It is a habit I have fallen into, for which I am very sorry. Money is the least important thing in the world. Only the worthless things are to be had for money. Those things which are beyond price, thank God, are to be had for the asking. Take it, child. Tomorrow is Christmas Day. I should be grieved indeed if there were no Alice for you on Christmas Day, as grieved as if there were no Santa Claus." There was something so unearthly about this strange old man that Alice wondered if she were not yet in Wonderland. With a sobriety quite out of keeping with her usually merry disposition, she thanked him, and went forth into the snow-clad streets. The plethora of Santa Clauses spending the holiday week-end in the city bewildered Alice, and now, after a long afternoon in the hurly-burly of metropolitan life, she was becoming tired. The number of Santa Clauses resident upon earth appalled her, and the extravagance of their promises, while pleasant enough, almost frightened her. Without any questions asked, even her address, which, had it been requested, would have taxed her wits rather severely, they accepted her commissions and guaranteed immediate delivery. The final excursion through the great department stores had been adventurous and diverting, but now, toward nightfall, was becoming monotonous, what with its profusion of Kris-Kringles and street-hawkers, and its babble of 11th-hour shoppers. It was like witnessing a really thrilling movie drama for the second time, thought Alice, who had initiated herself into the delights of moving picture entertainment for the first time that day, and wondered at its remarkable duplication. By 5 o'clock the little girl knew just what each and every Santa Claus was going to say to her, and what was coming next, and that one, at least, of the 3 remaining Santas would want to kiss her. She had been kissed almost to death, as it was, and that was beginning to bore her, too. It occurred to Alice, who was a shrewd little girl and not one of your bleating lambs, that Santa Claus, despite his profusion, or because of it, might be something of an old fraud after all. She was entirely certain that not one of him resembled the jolly old saint of her mental picture. The cottony fellow at Wanacooper's was not a bit red and chubby, nor very jovial either. And she hoped that the others, at the Emporium and the bargain store and the Bon Marché, would agree more sympathetically, as to corpulence, with the merry and very dear old gentleman of her favorite poem. She repeated the first lines softly under her breath. "'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse." Well, that was not surprising. Obviously, all the creatures who might otherwise have been stirring about the house on the night before Christmas were crowding and jostling each other in department stores, buying useless presents for people they didn't like. Alice thought it odd that this hadn't occurred to her before. It made the beginning of the poem quite clear. The Santa Claus at the Emporium was entirely surrounded by children. Entirely surrounded? Why not? The schoolroom definition of an island is authority for it. An island is a body of land entirely surrounded by water. Sticklers for accuracy will have it that the entirely is extraneous. If, they say, if he or it, that is Santa Claus, or the island, is surrounded by anything, whether water or children, he, or it, is surrounded, and that is all there is to it. Not entirely surrounded, just surrounded. Happily, Alice knew nothing of this. As for us, we are nothing if not independent, and care nothing for grammarians, nothing at all. The Santa Claus at the Emporium was entirely surrounded by children, just like all his duplicates, and in the midst of an alarming racket was writing long lists of juvenile wants in a big bookkeeper's ledger. The big bookkeeper was nowhere about, and so the old fellow went right ahead, just as if it had been his own ledger, and filled as many columns as a child wished, in the most amiable manner in the world. He was the nicest Santa Claus Alice had yet seen. He did not immediately notice Alice, who was neither larger nor smaller than most of the other children, shouting around him. But when he did notice her, he liked her right away. He liked the old-fashioned way of her, and her last-century clothes, and from the way she looked at him he was sure that she, at least, believed in him, and wasn't dropping in just to see how much she could get out of him. And then he hurried so that he could finish quickly with the others and get around to Alice. It wasn't very long until there she was, right up beside him, with his dear old whiskers tickling her shell-like ears, one of them anyway, and his pen poised over a perfectly blank page, ready to write down anything that Alice asked him to. And his voice, too, was very pleasant. "Now," said this kindly old saint, adjusting his eyebrows with some care, for they were slightly moth-eaten and appeared to be falling off, and no wonder either, for some hundreds of boys and girls had been leaning against them all day. "Now," said this nice old man, "what do you wish me to bring you for Christmas, little golden hair?" There was something charming about the way he emphasized the "you" that put Alice at ease immediately. So she told him all about the lovely doll and the darling kitten and the sweet bird she wanted and had been wanting for a long time, and all about the books she needed with which to catch up on the world, for she had been locked away for so long that she felt a bit out of date, and such phrases as League of Nations and Maple Nut Sunday simply meant nothing to her, while they were the common property of every other girl and boy in the land. The good-natured old soul wrote them all down very carefully, and then kissed Alice just as she had expected he would. He promised faithfully to deliver every one of her order in person, and warned her about seeing that the hearth fire was extinguished before midnight. "Because promptly at midnight," he said, "I shall come down the chimney." Alice giggled at that. "You mean the chimney, don't you?" she asked. "Chimney, indeed!" snorted Santa Claus. "After all these years, don't you think I know the difference between a chimney and a chimley? No, sir, I come down a chimney every time. I'll leave it to everyone here." And turning to the crowd of boys and girls around him, he asked, "How do I get into the house, children?" "Down the chimney!" roared the chorus. "You see," said Santa Claus. Alice did see, and felt very much ashamed of her display of ignorance. "Never mind," said Santa Claus kindly, "but I think," he added, "you had better go with my assistant, and be quite sure we have all these things in stock. He'll be glad to show you around. It's all free, you know. Just look around as long as you like, and if you see anything else you want, come right back and tell me about it." There was a little boy standing beside Santa Claus with a metal tag on his collar, and the generous old gentleman turned to him and told him to go and fetch his, that is, Santa Claus's, assistant. While Alice was waiting, a lot of other children pushed forward, and Alice was pretty nearly forgotten. But after a while she heard someone say, "Oh, he's coming now. He'll be here in just a minute now." And at the same moment she saw Santa Claus's assistant coming toward her. He was a sprightly little fellow, and Alice decided to like him. He came up in a sort of blue-green light, which danced all around him, and without the slightest hesitation Alice took his hand and walked away with him. The little man's fingers were so cold and hard, though, that Alice was surprised, and when she was sure he wasn't looking, she looked him over earnestly. After she had done that, she almost screamed, used as she was to odd things in Wonderland, for the little man was made of wood. Everything was wood, and Alice was holding on to his wooden fingers, and he was talking out of his wooden mouth, and the whole affair was the most wooden episode Alice could remember. His remarks concerning some of the books Alice wanted, the little girl thought, were the most wooden thing about him. But the little man's face was rather nice, for it was highly painted in blue and green, and he had bright yellow eyes that fairly sparkled with enamel. "Let's see," said the wooden man. "Dolls were first on the list, weren't they? Well, here we are. We call this room the Kingdom of Dolls, although, as a matter of fact, it is ruled by a queen, and never did have a king, because the queen is rather old and nobody will marry her. And as she won't allow any of the other dolls to marry until she herself finds a king, it makes it hard for the younger ones." "Dear me," said Alice, "do you suppose I might get a peep at the Queen without being seen?" "Easy enough," said the wooden man, "for there she is, that long-haired doll with the purple robe. She likes to be looked at, and I need hardly remark that her hair is false. She's awfully stuck up, though, and we won't tarry long, for she'd only snub us." "What a funny crown she is wearing!" laughed Alice, turning her head to look back. "You may well say so," said the wooden man ironically, "for it is made of kistletoe. She never takes it off." "Kistletoe," said Alice, and then, forgetting her humiliating experience about the chimley, "don't you mean mistletoe?" "No, I mean kistletoe," replied the wooden man, rather impatiently. "Everybody knows what kistletoe is. But then, perhaps you are too young. When you are older, you will know more." "I'm 13," said Alice, with proper dignity. "13!" shrieked the wooden man so loudly that Alice felt sure she had offended again. "What a dreadfully unlucky number! I should be frightened to death to be 13. How long have you been 13? "Nearly 2 months now," Alice confessed miserably. Then she brightened. "But everybody has to be 13 sometime. Weren't you ever 13? "Never!" declared the wooden man firmly. "When my 13th birthday approached, I tore off an entire year of the calendar and passed right into my 14th year. Of course, there was a fearful row about it, but it's really just like skipping a grade at school. If you're smart enough, you can do it. We have some very nice calendars," he added professionally. Alice was frankly bewildered, but she had forgotten her wounded dignity. In a moment her attention was attracted by a succession of melodious sounds, ending on a queer upward inflection that seemed to leave the phrase unfinished and hanging in the air. "Do listen!" she exclaimed. "Isn't that too sweet? It sounds like a bird singing." "Most birds do," said the wooden man dryly. "That's your bird," he added more politely. "You asked for a bird, you know." "But why does it end its song so abruptly?" asked Alice. "It doesn't seem to finish." "Confinement," answered the little guide briefly. "Its cage is too small. Its notes only reach the top of the cage, and then echo back into its own ears, which naturally surprises it into silence. It's too bad, for it's losing its upper register. It once sang very well." "Well, I shall let it go when I get it," declared Alice with decision. "You may do as you wish, of course," agreed the wooden man, "but you'll only be wanting another one next Christmas." They hurried forward, pressing through the crowd about the cage. It was humorous the way the people fell back on either side of the wooden man's sharp elbows. What they saw when they reached the cage was a beautiful yellow bird with black wings and big black eyes, swinging and singing on a perch of gold. "Wound up too tightly," muttered the wooden man. "One of the monkeys has been monkeying with the key." With a ferocious glare at the children around him, he reached in a hand, and Alice heard a sharp click. The bird stopped singing in the middle of a note. Then the wooden man lifted the little creature from its perch and brought it forth with as little concern as if it were made of wood, too. "Oh!" cried Alice in distress. "You mustn't hurt the bird. It wasn't its fault that somebody monkeyed with the key." The word "monkeyed" puzzled her, but she supposed it was all right, since that was what the wooden man had said. But the wooden man only laughed, and held out the bird for her inspection. Then Alice saw that it was not a real bird at all, but was made of thin metal so skillfully painted as to look real. "You forget this is Toyland," grinned the wooden man. "This bird is no more real than I am, than these children are, than you are." "Ain't I real?" asked Alice in alarm. Quickly correcting herself, she said, "Am I not real?" "Real enough," said the wooden man casually. "A real nuisance," he muttered under his breath, but fortunately Alice did not hear this rude remark. He continued more pleasantly, "Oh, the bird is real enough, too, but it's been wound up too tightly. It doesn't know what it is singing, or why it is singing. It lacks a soul." This remark was too deep for Alice, so she made no reply. After a minute she asked, "Aren't there any more animals?" "Birds aren't animals," sneered the wooden man, and then he was very much ashamed of himself. "I beg your pardon," he said contritely. "I had forgotten you are only 13." He shuddered as he mentioned the sinister number. "Well, yes, there is the performing pony, and the whistling toad, and the talking dog, and the teddy bear, and the laughing hyena, and the sorrowful snake, and the ingenious ibex, and the loquacious lynx, and, we have quite a menagerie." He looked quizzically at Alice, and suddenly began to sing, "Oh, ferocious and atrocious is the beast they call the lynx, and fierce his howl, and black his scowl, and red his jowl, methinks." "You have a very nice voice," said Alice, as the singer paused. "I wish you wouldn't interrupt," snapped the wooden man. "First you want to hear about the animals, and then you don't." He stopped short. "Do you really like my voice?" he asked eagerly. Then his head drooped woodenly, for he saw that Alice was no longer paying attention. "I haven't much of a voice myself," mused the little girl, "but I think I could speak a piece." "Let's hear it," urged the wooden man. And in a moment Alice heard herself reciting, "I thought I heard a parson swear because his eyes were sore. I turned around and saw it was the watchdog's honest snore. Alas," he whispered tearfully, "that 2 times 2 is 4. I thought I saw a mastodon upon the pantry shelf. I looked again and saw it was a picture of myself. 'Oh dear,' I said, 'the albatross is eating all the pelf.'" "What's pelf?" demanded the wooden man critically. "Pelf is I think it's something to eat," explained Alice. "But I didn't have to say pelf. Could have said elf, or delf, or skelf," jeered the wooden man. "Poetic license is a dangerous thing for a girl of 13. I shall see that yours is revoked at once." Alice began to cry with shame and humiliation. "There, there!" cried the wooden man, ashamed of himself again. "I was only plaguing you. You rhyme beautifully, much better than I do. Now let's go and see P.D." "P.D.?" queried Alice, drying her tears. "Who is P.D.?" "Why, the plausible donkey, to be sure," laughed the wooden man. "You said you wanted to see some more animals." "Why don't you call him D.P.?" asked Alice after a moment, as they walked toward the menagerie. "Why?" The wooden man seemed suspicious. "Democratic Party," giggled Alice, and then stopped as she caught sight of the wooden man's face, which was contorted with pain. "I beg your pardon," she added hastily. But the wooden man wouldn't speak another word until they had arrived at the donkey shelter, when he became cheerful once more. "Let me introduce you to the plausible donkey," he said gallantly. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Donkey," said Alice timidly. "What beautiful eyes you have." "The better to see you with, my child," quoted the plausible donkey, just to show that he was not such a donkey as he looked. "What can I do for you today?" "Can you sing?" asked Alice innocently. "Heavens!" groaned the wooden man in her ear. "Now you've done it. He has no more voice than a crow." But the plausible donkey was pleased by the question. "It is not surprising that you do not know my ability in that respect," he smiled, "since this is your first visit. The fact is," he blushed modestly, "the fact is, I am descended from that notable singer, Max Welton." "Max Welton?" echoed Alice in surprise. "I thought that was a song." "It was originally," the plausible donkey said plausibly. "My ancestor was named after the song because his brays were bonny." "Oh," said Alice politely, but the wooden man snickered and spoiled it all. "You're making fun of me," she cried, with tears in her voice, "and I don't want to hear you sing now." She hurried away, leaving the wooden man to apologize as best he could for Alice's impoliteness. He was puffing mightily when he overtook her. "I think we've had enough of animals," he said, between gasps. "Let's go over and see the books." It was evident, even to Alice, that he was getting tired of his charge. They were in the book department before they knew it, before Alice knew it, at any rate. All around them were books, heaps and heaps of them, on tables and shelves, and piled on long counters, and hung up in booths, and in the very center of the immense room, whose horizon could not be seen for the stacks of books, was a great American eagle, made entirely of books, the work of the chief window-dresser, who was a very literary man. "Have you the young visitors?" asked Alice. "Young visitors?" echoed the wooden man. "Santa Claus has dozens of them. Hundreds every day. Thousands, I guess." "Silly! It's a book," said Alice. "It was written by a friend of mine, Daisy Ashford, when she was only 9 years old." The wooden man looked very suspiciously at his charge. "Nobody could write a book at 9, he said with finality. "Daisy could, and did," declared Alice. "Nobody could get it published anyway," sneered the wooden man. "Of course, anybody could write one." "And she had it published, and here it is," cried Alice triumphantly. She snatched a book from a long counter and presented it to her companion. The wooden man cautiously took it, turned it over, and handed it back. "Where does it say she is only 9 years old?" he demanded. "In the preface, of course," answered Alice. "She's older now, but she was only 9 when she wrote it." She whirled over the leaves until she found the place. "There it is. Sir James Barrie himself says so, in the preface." Said the wooden man. "He probably wrote it himself, and he wasn't 9 when he wrote it either, although he's pretty childish, at that. He's writing introductions now for anybody. He would at least know how to spell visitors, wouldn't he?" The wooden man stared at the cover. At sight of the title he was visibly shaken. "It might be a typographical error," he ventured. "But if you know this Daisy Ashford, what's her book about?" "It's about a man who was in love with a young woman," lucidly explained Alice. "He was rather an old man, and—" "Then Barrie wrote it," interrupted the wooden man. "That ends that." "It doesn't end anything," cried Alice, almost in tears. "And he doesn't write as many introductions as H.G. Wells, anyway." "Oh!" cried the wooden man. "Well?" "Wells," said Alice sharply. "Wells! Wells! How many wells make a river?" "Really," admonished the wooden man, "you mustn't get out of temper. I don't like wells any more than you do. I find it difficult to get to the bottom of them." He fell to singing. "Mr. Britling saw it through. That was more than I could do. Central, ring up heaven's bells. Get me God for H.G. Wells." Alice appeared shocked at this levity. "You should not be so Leviticus," she said, "even in a good cause." "I don't mean to be irrelevant," replied the wooden man. "I was only reviewing Mr. Wells in rhyme. Would you like to hear the next verse? It's about Amy Lowell." "I don't believe I'd better," answered Alice nervously. "Is she anything like Daisy Ashford?" "They're not exactly as like as twins," admitted the wooden man. "Your Daisy is rather slender, is she not?" "Oh, very." "Then she's not," said the wooden man with conviction. "I have never seen Amy Lowell, but Mr. Bitter Winter, who was here one day last week, told me that he had got up in a street car and offered to be one of 3 men to give Miss Lowell a seat." "Dear me!" exclaimed Alice. "She needs some of my cake." "Cake?" asked the wooden man. But Alice, fearing she had betrayed herself, would say no more about it. "Well," said the wooden man, "we've checked on the doll and the bird and the books. There was to be a kitten, I believe. That means we'll have to go back to the menagerie." "I won't go back to the menagerie," Alice said firmly, "and if the kittens are no more polite than the donkeys, I won't have one." "You'll have to ask Santa Claus to strike it off the list, then, or you'll have it sure tomorrow morning. And we'll have to hustle, too, for the old boy closes up at 8 o'clock. He went on strike for a shorter day last month, 700 of him, and after 8 o'clock he won't do a lick of work." "Let's hurry," cried Alice breathlessly. So they hurried back through the teeming aisles, past the plausible donkey, who brayed after them jeeringly, past the singing bird, which offered to finish its song if they would only tarry, past the stuck-up Queen of the Dolls, who ogled the wooden man shamefully, and at length arrived at the cottony dwelling of Santa Claus. But, alas! the door now was closed, and tacked to the outer panel was a large sign, "Gone to the races, back next year." "Oh," said Alice, "isn't it provoking? Now I shall have to have a kitten after all, and I suppose it will eat the bird and scratch the doll, and tear up the books and make me angry all day long." "No doubt," said the wooden man callously. "But what does he mean by the races?" asked curious Alice. "The reindeer races," replied the wooden man. "They race annually on Saturn's race track, and the winning Santa Claus is the boss Santa Claus of the year, and makes the rounds on Christmas Eve. It doesn't take a minute to get there, and probably by this time the races are over." "I hope our Santa Claus won, don't you?" cried Alice. "What's the difference?" asked the wooden man. "They all look alike." "That's so," said Alice reflectively, "but this one was very nice." "They're paid to be nice," said the wooden man cynically. "I'm paid to be nice. You don't think I've been piloting you around all afternoon for fun, do you?" "Well," said Alice with spirit, "I like that. I'm sure if I knew who paid you, I'd report you and you wouldn't get a penny. You don't deserve it, for you haven't been nice. I shall leave you this minute." "Goodbye," grinned the wooden man mockingly. "Close the door after you as you go out." That was a very rude wooden man, thought Alice to herself, as, half blinded with tears, she hurried through the snowy streets. It is very evident that he tore off his 13th year. That is the year when people learn to be polite. And he said I was not real. I never knew till I was 13 how real I was. Without quite knowing where she was going, unconsciously her footsteps strayed toward the shop of the old bookman, the only friend she had found who seemed to be genuine. The precious volume, which once she had thought a prison, was safe beneath her arm. Well, she knew now what she would do. She would give it back, and if the old man were so kind as to let her, she would creep back into the pages and be happy there again forever. "Poor child," smiled the old bookman, when she had related her adventures and cried over them. "Indeed, he did need his 13th year. That is the age at which one best appreciates what reality is. Once learned, it is a lesson never to be forgotten. To the child of 13, all things are real if they are beautiful, and all things are unreal which are ugly. Anything is real that we want to be real. Sensible writers, like Barrie, learn this at 13 and tear off all the remaining years of the calendar. Time passes, but they remain 13. They improve their style, their appreciation of beautiful things deepens, their outlook is broader and finer, but at heart they are still children. They have never escaped from their 13th year, and they never will, and they are very glad about it." To this astonishing harangue, Alice had no reply. For truth to tell, she understood very little of it. But it sounded real, and she liked the look on the old bookman's face as he said it. "Would you mind, sir," she timidly asked, "if I were to creep back into my book and hide again on your shelf?" "Are you quite sure you can manage it?" asked the old man. "Oh, yes," said Alice, "for I still have a piece of cake that I brought with me. I had 2 pieces, one to make me grow and one to make me small again. Just watch me." Then she took a few crumbs of cake from her pocket and began to eat them, and the old bookman, standing by, saw her shrink down and down and down until she was such a tiny little thing at his feet that his eyes could barely find her. He picked her up gently and opened the book lying on the counter. "You must find the place," he said. "Do you remember it?" With a little sigh of relief, Alice slipped into the right picture, where, to her great joy, she fitted like a glove. And suddenly the picture was complete again, and the old bookman, turning the leaves over, could not find her, there were so many of her, and he did not know which one was really her. Suddenly the book fell from his hand and clattered onto the floor, striking his foot as it fell. At the same instant, of course, he awoke, sitting in his chair near the old stove. He smiled a little, but was not surprised, for he was used to dreaming strange and pleasant dreams. As he stooped to pick up the book, a customer entered the store. "What have you there?" asked the stranger, looking at the book in the old man's hand. "Alice in Wonderland? Charming thing! What do you ask for it?" "Not this copy," said the old man firmly. "This is my personal copy. This is one book you cannot buy." End of Part 9. Part 10 of A Christmas Miscellany 2023 by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 10, The Story of Zephyr, A Christmas Story, by Jeanie Oliver Smith. Chapter 1, Edward's Wish. "Father, may I have an English setter for my Christmas present?" Edward spoke in a subdued tone, for the president of a certain association, a country club, of which his father was a member, had come to say good-bye. One branch of the party of campers on the lake was about to break up. City schools were calling them from forest and from field. The stranger had taken a seat on the broad veranda, his dog at his heels, his carriage and horses waiting. Bruno knew his little friend Edwy. The boy stood stroking the dog's ears and speaking gentle words to him. The dog seemed to listen, but although he was all attention and laid his head down on crossed paws, one eye was alert for the movement of his master. A dog, an English setter like Bruno, was one thing which Edwy had sought with constant iteration since he was old enough to talk, especially since he had seen the devotion of Bruno for his master and even his master's horses. He had also gained the dog's confidence towards himself. Edwy's mother felt that she must not let him keep on hoping for the impossible. They could not take a dog to a city home while they were building the camp on the lake. It was equally out of the question either to carry him back and forth on the cars, or to leave him at home with servants while all the family were away. As he stood stroking the dog's ears and speaking his own little tender words to him, the watchful mother explained, aside, the reason of the refusal. "You know, Edwy, a dog gets so terribly homesick if left in the care of servants. Just see how Bruno is waiting to leap to his master's side and fly down the road the moment the horse's hoofs ring on the highway. When you are older—" How Edwy hated the words, "when you are older." It always meant that you couldn't have something when you wanted it. But as he was a well-bred child, he always kept quiet in company. He had sometimes confided to Willard, his brother, but that didn't help much. "Could I have a kitten, then? I do want some kind of a thing that isn't either dumb or dead." A certain chum of Edwy's, not the usual kind of a chum, but one in his own and Willard's estimation well worth of the name, had noticed the fact that the child had so bravely banished the frown of disappointment. She had also noted the fact that no ban had been placed against a kitten, and a plan was forming in her mind, but she did not divulge it. Chapter 2, The Little Trapper. Edwy had been called the Little Trapper. He had read every book he could find about animals. After reading some of them, he would be the warrior bold, would long to be old enough to shoot and slay and pursue big game through the forest spaces. But, bless his heart, he hadn't the least idea that there was any tragedy in it. He had made box traps with his own hands, but in such a way, however, that it would hardly frighten the little creatures to be caught, for he would only keep the little prisoners an hour, or a minute perhaps, feed them, and let them go, free. One day he had found in his trap a pretty brown-eyed muskrat, and the creature found himself liberated beside his own stream, not a bit the worse for his experience. And one day he found a strange slate-colored dormouse, but it had managed to get out of its cage by its own ingenuity or someone's help. Another day he caught several little squirrels, first getting one, then another and another, and letting them pass by a bridge of his own or his father's contriving from one box to another. But they were all to be set free in a short time, and seemed to think it was mere play. At first they seemed to try to tease each other, their comrades, for the moment. He had discovered that in this first stage they would not eat, but after a while he had rushed into the house to tell Willard his new discovery. "Why, Willard, they've got all acquainted with each other, and they know me. They seem to know that I don't mean to hurt them, and now they grab for anything I offer them to eat." It soon became evident that the squirrel families would have to be more severely dealt with, for more than once they had disturbed the little birds on their nests, and in some cases had been known to destroy their eggs. So a plan was formed to transport one or two of the squirrel families to another portion of the woods, and thus leave the robins and the warblers in undisputed possession near the camp. At length came the plans for the opening of the doors of the temporary trap, to introduce the squirrels to their new forest home. Where the lake laps the shore, several rowboats were drawn up in line, and it was but the work of a moment to embark, for all the interested members of the little group could enter readily into the child's feelings. The morning was one of the gems of June, with crystal sky and lake. As the boats sped out towards the further shore, the wise little creatures in the box crowded further back, massed themselves in a bunch, their feet towards the opening of the box, their pointed noses quivering with excitement. Their little sharp bead-like eyes alert, but less full of fear than at first, for already they had grown familiar with a petting word from the little trapper and friend, and were fast growing trustful of their human kind. Now the problem was to get them to cross the small channel of deep water which lay between them and the shore. A rustic bridge was made by means of a wide board, and then the doors were opened. Such a patter of little twinkling feet as they ran, one after another, low-geared, for the land, while the party sailed back or remained on the lake to enjoy the delights of rod and line, the feast of the flowers on the banks, and the songs of numberless birds, all part of the glorious summer-time. Chapter 3. A Welcome Guest. Some weeks previous to this, while the campers still thought they had the whole summer before them, a little white kitten with gold spots had come, seemingly from nowhere, and had sought admission, not to Edwy's camp, but to his uncle's across the lake. His uncle's wife was the dearest, the most teasable aunt in the world. She was known sometimes as Aida, from a pet name one of them had given her. They had never called her aunt, but always some nice pet name, and always pretended they didn't care a flip for her. But she knew better, for wasn't she their own mother's sister, who had also a pet name of her own? And were they not both daughters of this great chum of theirs, who, as their father had told them, was entirely their own contemporary and equal? But at the same time they mustn't tease her or treat her as if they were playing football, and mustn't touch her pretty white dress with their candy fingers. Edwy was glad that the kitten had come to visit them. He was afraid that the winter would be hard on the poor thing. Everybody said it could take care of itself, but why couldn't it take care of itself now? It came every morning to ask them for food, and would give its high-toned purr of satisfaction when they had fed it. Much as Edwy liked it, he was glad that it had not come to his father's camp, for they had some little rabbits. They had brought them, when old enough, from their old home, and had let them run wild through the woods and underbrush near the woods and the lake. "But would you believe it, Willard," he said to his brother, "they come back to our camp just as soon as they hear my voice shouting to them, half a mile away, and then they begin to show up out of the underbrush." It was always jolly at his aunt's camp, for in his own camp he feared the rabbits and the kitten might not agree, and he and Willard were quite as much at home in the one place as the other. The only time when the kitten had visited their camp on the hill was once, when they had all been away a few days, and when both camps were empty for that length of time. On coming back, the very first thing they saw in front of Edway's father's camp was the little white kitten sitting on the doorstep, crying a glad welcome to them, arching its back, and reaching up for them to pet it. Very soon Edwy took the megaphone from its corner and called over the lake, "Hello!" The sound of Aida's voice came floating back. "Yes, I can hear you." "We all thought our little Zephyr was lost, but she is here, all safe and sound, and she's had a bowl of milk. Willard and I are going to row the boat over the lake and bring her back to your house, Aida, for that is her real home." On reaching the other shore, Aida and Moma were glad to welcome the boys with their pet, for they had all feared that she was lost. She had found her way to the other house along a wood road, they thought, all the way. If she had gone along the borders of the lake, it would have been much nearer, but it was swampy that way, so she must have taken the high road and had made friends with the tame rabbits, not hurting any of them. The boys were well pleased with the result of their afternoon's visit, for Zephyr seemed so glad to get home that she went through all her little antics for them, hiding under the woodpile, then leaping out to surprise them, and glancing up in their faces almost as if she were laughing, trying races with them along the wooded shore. After the boys had partaken of the nice little lunch that Aida had planned for them, some cake and berries, crimson raspberries that had grown in the field by the roadside, it was time to take the boat for their homeward trip. Zephyr followed them to the bank and looked after them as long as there was light enough to see the boat. Aida also watching them off, and their dear mother outlined against the further shore, waiting their arrival. Chapter 4. Zephyr Second. It was Edway himself who had named the cat Zephyr Second. For one summer they had a cat visitor that he named Zephyr, but she had gone back to her home among the mountains, and they had never seen her again. But for this little kitten that had come to them, so white, so pretty and engaging, a real snowflake in color, so tiny and playful, Zephyr seemed such an appropriate name. He could not call it Zephyr alone, for that would have seemed like forgetting the former one, who was not so beautiful as this one, and had never leaped higher than one's head like this one. But Zephyr Second, or Zephyr Two, would be quite the thing, and keep the former one in memory. He was glad that this one had come to his Aunt Aida's, for they would be a month longer in camp, and then Zephyr's winter would not seem so long. He seemed more and more appreciative of all the graceful pranks of his pet when she ran like a wild, happy thing, leaping up as high as the fence posts after butterflies in the sunshine, running up to the very tops of the trees and back again, but never catching the birds. Oh, no, she was too happy to lie in wait for them, and the best trick of all was when she would sit on the bank and watch for a boat coming from the other camp, every time he and Willard were out of her sight. She would listen for the lapping of the oars, then leap to the bank, give a glad little cry, arch her back, and give her sweet, high-toned purr when they came near. One evening, before it was quite dark, when supper was just ready at their father's camp on the hill, Aida and Moma had come over to stay all night. They were to have their evensong with the organ, violin, and guitar, and the sweet, human, sympathetic voices of all in unison. The songs which Edway was sure could be heard by the birds in their nests high up in the tall trees that leaned over the camp roof. They had just heard Willard and his father fastening their boat at the foot of the hill, and now they, the truants, were running quickly up the stone steps from the landing, when Willard, the first comer, opened the door and thrust some object inside. It was none other than Zephyr. While we were passing your dock, we saw Zephyr waiting all alone on the bank. We called to her, and she came running down, and we took her right into the boat with us, and here she is. "You precious darling," said Edwy, stroking her. As supper was now ready, he took her in his lap, and contrary to all rules, he fed her, as the poet Maeterlinck used to do with his pet cat, talking to her in his happy voice in his own place at the table. The evening had grown cool enough to have a fire of apple-tree wood blazing before the broad hearth, so before they began their evensong, Willard had laid the moss-covered logs together and lighted them, removing first the dainty fender, which his own hands had made with artistic deftness, having woven in the name of their camp among the interstices of the woven wire. Now, where the welcome fire glow shone through it on the hearth-rug, Zephyr had taken her position, quite at home and happy, purring her gray thrums, louder than ever in her contentment. Chapter 5. The Real Meaning of Christmas. It seemed now as if this second camp, where Zephyr lived, had new attractions for Edwy. He would spend the days happily with his friends. Here was that teasable Aunt Aida and his friend Moma, his own little conceit to avoid the longer name. But then he had as many pet names for her as there were months in the year. She never held up other boys to them as examples, for she always seemed to think that he and Willard were the best ever. But it was drawing near the time that one branch of the family of campers would have to say good-bye to summer fields and woods and go back to the city and school. Edwy felt a little blue about leaving his pets, and had a quiet talk with this special friend of his, after the rest had gone out on the lake to have a last chance at the trout fishing before leaving the lake. He was in the reminiscent mood that precedes sleep, and was telling his friend how much he wished they would always stay in the country. But, after all, you would miss the bright, happy Christmas in the city home, you know. "Oh, yes, to be sure, and we'll have the lovely snowflakes coming down from the sky, and a lot of good times." She had asked him then, when they were talking about Christmas, and about all the delights of that time, if he knew the real meaning of Christmas. "Why, yes," he had answered, "it is to keep in mind a very great event in the world, the greatest that ever happened. But then, you know, it wouldn't be Christmas to us boys if we didn't get some gifts of our very own, for we can't always be thinking big thoughts." So many things, he continued, were impossible until he was older. He had wanted a dog, but he couldn't have that. He had asked for a cat, but of course he couldn't have that. He could only have kids' things. If he was only a shepherd, he could have some lambs. He had once had a tame weasel, and it was the dearest thing. But you couldn't pet a weasel, although you could get to love it, and feel as if the world had come to an end when it died. But there was always one Christmas that he remembered. He had got a lot of things that day, but when night came he was so tired that he had a fight with his brother. Oh, not a real fight, you know, only the kind that brothers always have. People may think you awful and send you off to bed, but half the time you don't know what's the matter. Why, that was only last Christmas. Do you remember that night, Mama? Oh, perfectly. We were at home in the city, he continued. You had come up to my room and sat by me. I was all covered up with a quilt, so you wouldn't see my red eyes. All at once we heard someone singing. It was only Mamma and Aida. Mamma was playing the air on the dear violin, Aida accompanying her on the piano and singing, and she always gives one a chance to hear the words. Yes, Edwy, I remember. You flew out of bed and leaned over the banisters to hear. It was from the oratorio of the Messiah. You wished they would play and sing it all night. You had forgotten all your troubles in a moment. Oh, I can hear it now, even after all these months, as the remembrance of it comes through the still evening air. He shall feed his flock, like a shepherd. He shall carry the lambs in his bosom, and shall gently lead those that are with young. Then you told me the story about his life, after I came back to bed, and I fell asleep, saying it over and over. He shall feed his flock, like a shepherd, and carry the lambs in his bosom, the little lambs. Chapter 6. Departure of the first group of campers. Edway's special friend had noticed how bravely he had given up the idea of taking any of the country pets to the city, at least until he grew older. But there was one little plan which she had not as yet divulged to anybody. She had remarked to herself that a kitten had not been forbidden, simply because it had not been thought of as a possibility. After the boys and their parents had said good-bye to their camp, and the whistle of their train could be heard far over the hills, she began to take a new course with Zephyr. The little lonesome creature would go often down to the bank and seem to watch for the coming of a boat and a welcoming war-whoop, but would always come back disappointed. It was at such times that Aida and her mother would have a loving word for Zephyr, and it evidently was at a loss to know what such unusual attention meant. For instance, Zephyr might have wondered why she was so often invited to go to sleep in a large cushioned box, with a wire cover, not often closed, over her, and why she was fed occasional dainties in this place, until she had grown to love it, and feel perfectly at home in it. Up to this time they had not been quite sure but that someone might claim Zephyr, but they had found out by accident that a family had moved away from a nearby hamlet, and had left this helpless creature to the mercy of fierce dogs and winter terrors. But a kind Providence, that doth not let even the sparrows fall, had brought her to a good home, and now that it had been decided what could be done for her by the remaining friends at the camp, there was no lack of affection shown. So Zephyr grew soft and fluffy and more engaging than ever, had no fear of her wire-covered box in which she was being prepared for a longer journey, and eventually for summers and winters to come. In this way she might be brought back and forth to the camp every summer. Some weeks had passed before the second army of campers were ready to leave. The autumn days had turned the leaves of the forest from gold to crimson, the hermit thrush had ceased its song of the eventide, and when they were all ready to leave the camp, Zephyr did not seem at all surprised to be taken along with them. She was taken to Aida's home at first, for her, Aida's, tall husband had at last come home, braving the dangers of the war-ravaged seas. Chapter 7. One of Zephyr's Summer Homes. As Aida's real summer home was in a lovely small city in one of the more northern belts of the state, she would not go to the great city for a month yet. So this country house, the Blake home, happened to be Zephyr's first stopping place. While mother and daughter, in the quiet of the home garden, had many a talk under the trees about the friends who had preceded them to that great city, which has always welcomed its own people, and also the oppressed of all nations, and honored them so long as the privileges of citizenship were appreciated. To those who seemed to understand intuitively that the Statue of Liberty, presented by a sister nation, meant more of friendship, loyalty, and respect than words could express. It was a most wonderful boon, and at once the Empire City seemed to become law-abiding by absorption, under the leadership of the great souls who ruled both city and country, and their appreciation of this new and lasting bond. While Aida and her mother were happy in the garden and thinking big thoughts, Edway's pretty name for all he could not quite comprehend, Aida, looking up, saw a shadow pass over her mother's face. If Edway were here, dearest, he would ask his friend why, and he would wait for you to answer his loving question. But I think I know. How do any of us know, when our boys come to be grown men, what may they not have to do to hold such liberty sacred? Can we be sure that their beautiful lives might not have to pay the toll of enrollment for their sacred trust for our country? It was a thought she would not leave in a moment. If both boys were here, dear, they would remind you of the shepherd's story, which you have so often told them. By way of taking her mind from life's strange vicissitudes, Aida called her attention to the fact of Zephyr's disappearance. Where could it have gone? The little creature never seemed to have felt quite so much at home as at the north. It had missed the lake, the boats, and the merry voices of the two boys as they came between the two camps, with the sound of beating oars. Sure enough, Zephyr had gone without even touching her breakfast. Just at that moment a little girl came along the garden walk, stepping over the bank beside Aida's lovely flowers, many of them still blooming, although so late in the autumn. "I've brought your kitty home," she said gently, "but she loves to stay right in my arms. I found her in the schoolroom, and I don't believe she would have been afraid of any of the boys, for they all petted her. But the teacher was having them say some dates in unison, and it made such a racket that she came running to me, and I knew just who owned her, for I had seen her in your garden." "Oh, thank you 1,000 times! Zephyr shall know you as her little friend. May I take her to school again?" "Every day, if you wish, and play with her here, too, under the trees." "What were the dates that the scholars were saying in unison?" the mother asked. "One was the date on which the beautiful Statue of Liberty came from France with its motto, 'Liberty enlightening the world.'" "Just what we were talking about, dear," said the mother thoughtfully. "Ever since its arrival it has been wreathed with loving and often poetic thought, and I am glad that our schools are asking you to remember the dates of great events. While we are staying here, she can go to school with you every day, and you are welcome here, too, among Aida's flowers." Chapter 8. A Surprise. Winter had really come at last. The snowflakes had covered the brown fields, and time was fast hastening on to bring the great day of all the year, Christmas Day. Aida had sent gifts that she knew they would like. Their uncle had brought them some gifts from Paris, and this special friend of theirs had her own plan that made her smile to herself when she thought how Edwy loved things that he could pet and fondle and call his own. The other presents had all been sent early to their city home, and messages of thanks had been sent back, but the question had been flashed back to the senders, "Why didn't you come yourselves? Christmas Day is never Christmas Day unless you are here." But it was almost over, and as yet not any sign of the rest of the group as the slow hours passed. All at once there was a loud sound of tramping in the hall, then a shout of welcome in the air, and Edway hoped it might be one person. No, two, whom he loved and who loved him. And sure enough, he was not disappointed. Aida was there, and right behind her Edway's friend appeared on the scene, all trim and fine, her eyes full of love. And before they knew it, she had made a pounce upon Edway, and the next moment had him in her arms. She said nothing about a wire-covered box that stood in the hall, but seeing it accidentally, after he had given her a good hug, a real bear hug, he said, "Oh, you've brought down one of my box traps. Is it one of them? But we don't need any box traps here, for there's nothing to catch." But Willard, by this time, had torn off the cover. The box was opened wide at last, and oh, wonder of wonders! Here was the little white cat, their beautiful Zephyr, looking up at them with questioning eyes. The shout that went up ended suddenly with the peculiarly happy screech of an Indian war-whoop, a sound they had not heard from Edway's lips for many a month. Instead of jumping out of her box at once, Zephyr sat up on her cushion and began to wash her face with her velvet paw, and when she saw Edwy she began at once that high-toned purr, as if to show her gratitude that after her long journey she had found her friends. Her next act was to jump out of her box, after one look at their glad faces, and another glance from floor to ceiling, and from ceiling to floor, she started on a wild chase after one of the Christmas apples that had rolled out on the floor. The boy and the cat now had their race of pure delight from room to room. While the grace of her motions seemed the most wonderful in the world, making all the people laugh, the rapt, happy look on Edwy's face was a greater joy. It was a marvel of expression. Zephyr was his very own, to keep always. End of Part 10. Part 11 of A Christmas Miscellany 2023 by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 11, The Dilemma of Santa Claus by Lloyd Castle Douglas. Among the many articles of my faith which have demanded revision from time to time, none has experienced more radical changes than my conception of Santa Claus. As a small child, I was more sure of Santa Claus than of God. Of course, I believed in God upon the advice of my elders and betters, in whose unbroken word I trusted, but I had never tried him out. Such requests as I made of him in the reverential rumble of my twilight supplications were extremely vague, a hazy sense of undefined need dissolved in a thin solution of rhythmic jingle. Nor do I recall any definite reactions thus obtained, except the pleasurable sensation produced by the word Amen. Indeed, unto this day, Amen is, to my taste, one of the most euphonious words in our language. On occasions, I have fairly yearned to hear it. Doubtless, this constitutes a confession of serious moral lack on my part. But if my thesis is to have merit, its conspicuous virtue must be truth. Heartened by this resolution to be entirely honest, come what may, let me further add concerning the memorized prayer of my early childhood, that it had an unpleasant trick of gouging into the most sensitive tissues of my subconscious. If I should die before I wake was one of the least enjoyable probabilities offered by the subjunctive mood, whither we commonly resort for our brightest prospects. And make me a good boy frankly invited one's memory to push into active consciousness certain hideous and humiliating defections, perhaps painfully fresh and recent, for which one had suffered much psychical shock. And mayhap physical also, for in the period to which I allude, Solomon's exhortations on parental disciplines were as apples of gold in pictures of silver in most respectable households. The depression, however, produced by Fushidi and Make Me a Good Boy was fleeting. The words of the solemn rite skidded over the surface of thought without gripping the road to one's serious reflections. So much for that. Too much, perhaps. Now, Santa Claus, to the child mind no less mysterious than God as to his nature, attributes, manner of life, and place of abode, was a scientific fact based upon experimental knowledge. Opinions might differ regarding minor dogmatic points as to the exact process by which he entered the house on Christmas Eve, for example, the ultra-conservative insisting that the chimney tradition simply must be adhered to, even in homes which boasted no such thing as a fireplace. They would have it that Santa Claus came down the stovepipe. Some of the most stiffly orthodox even believed he arrived through the valve in the steam radiator, though this was purely academic. No house where we lived was thus equipped. Again, there were certain conservatives who maintained that reindeer and sled constituted the only vehicular possibilities of Santa Claus, going so far as to defend the idea in green seasons when any sane mind would have repudiated such transportation as being hopelessly impractical. But however we may have differed over the adiaphora, we were all agreed that Santa Claus came on Christmas Eve and contrived to effect an entrance. After all, that was the important consideration. Nothing else mattered much, even if the disputants had arrived at a decision, which, so far as I know, they never did. Perhaps the debate is still brewing among the persons who know today that Santa Claus is real. Not very many of them, did I hear you say? Not very many persons who believe that Santa Claus is real. There are at least 4,500,000 people in this country alone who would stake their hobby horses and doll shoes that Santa Claus is the very realest of all known realities. But to resume. No sooner was Thanksgiving properly disposed of than one opened up negotiations with Santa Claus, not in a minor-keyed mumble of well-worn rhymes, but by letter. They were dignified letters, every way consistent with good business methods, not over-familiar, not presumptuous, sometimes given a bit to sly flattery, but on the whole quite sincere. It might be observed, of course, that all child letters are sincere. My young nephew writes me, "Dear Uncle, I have a new box of stationery, and so I am going to write you a letter." Nothing hypocritical about that, surely. He is under compulsion to write to somebody. Why not to me? These letters to Santa Claus were composed with great care. Much pains was taken in the printing of one's name, address, age, and sex. It was not enough to sign one's self John Henry Jones. To ensure against the receipt of a doll, or some such feminine trumpery, one said plainly, "I am a little boy, 6 years old, and you know what little boys like, don't you, Santa Claus?" Of course, one never said Santa, one wrote Santa. The proper pronunciation was Santy. All the people who believe that he is real say Santy. It is only after they have lost their faith that they begin to speak of him as Santa. There's a huge moral fact back of this, somewhere, waiting for an explorer to find it. Not infrequently, the tabulated list of one's more desperate needs was accompanied by prices of the same, care being taken to avoid making quotations in excess of the prevailing market rates on such articles. One never added the column and set down a total, for obvious reasons. A few of the main principles of psychology are instinctive. Now, there were other serious difficulties to be met in the retention of one's faith in Santa Claus, besides those already indicated. For several weeks previous to Christmas, he appeared in certain shops and bazaars, the announcement of his arrival duly heralded in the newspapers. Personally, I revolted against this with all my mind. Either the printed announcements lied, and their much advertised Santa Claus was some made-up impostor, or Santa Claus, the genuine and only, had allowed himself to be wickedly imposed upon to the abject humiliation of his followers. More recently I have seen the national flag unfurled at the end of a tiresome show or boresome speech, and experienced much the same sensations. But one day my anxieties on this score were all dispelled. I saw 2 of them engaged in earnest conversation on a street corner. I wondered whether each was contending that he was Santa Claus, and the other a pretender, until I passed quite near them and noted that no such issue was under discussion. It was a clear case that both of them couldn't be Santa Claus. The chances were strong that neither was Santa Claus. I confided my deduction to my mother, who had me in tow, and she repeated it to my father that evening at supper. He smiled and said that it was a rattling good illustration of something. I couldn't understand just what at the time. I think I know now. Perhaps he was thinking of the remark once made by a very thoughtful man concerning one's attitude toward greater mysteries. The time cometh when neither on this mountain nor in the temple will men worship the Father, for he is a spirit. Some of my youthful friends used to say that they tried to keep awake on Christmas Eve. Now and again a precocious child reported having made some noteworthy experiments in this field, usually subversive of faith and quite disconcerting to believers. For my own part, all such investigations were in bad taste, though I may have feared to put my wobbly faith to the supreme test. This invites close analysis. They used to tell us 25 years ago that it was wrong to read Bob Ingersoll and Tom Paine. Precisely why it was wrong they never explained convincingly. Perhaps it was in bad taste, too, or maybe it was inadvisable to put one's faith to the test. That also invites analysis. Not invariably, however, have these researches been destructive to faith. I know a boy who at the age of 4 saw Santa Claus. Just now, at 12, his faith is sorely tried. But whatever may be the present status of Santa Claus in his regard, he knows that he once saw him. Nothing can shake that firm conviction based upon the testimony of his senses. I distinctly recall the minutest detail of that event, which definitely demoted Santa Claus, in my own opinion, from his erstwhile safe and secure position as a reality to the fairyland of myth. It was on the morning of my 7th Christmas. I was sitting on the floor before our gay little tree. Santa Claus always brought our tree and decorated it. In some places he only brought the gifts, the tree being rigged by local forces. But with us, Christmas was the very busiest time of the year. Santa Claus, fully understanding the peculiar conditions at our house, not only brought our gifts, but trimmed the tree. On this morning I recognized some ornamental trifles on the pine branches as having done previous service in that capacity. It seemed a very strange coincidence that he should return with the identical china deer, with the broken antler, and the same prancing pony that had lost a stirrup. Without doubt, I could have invented some plausible explanation for this out of the depths of a faith optimistically elastic, but for the fact that my convictions had suffered much. All the harassing doubts with which I had successfully wrestled until now flooded over me, and I looked up into my mother's face and said, "Tell me, Mother, honestly, is there a Santa Claus?" And she told me, honestly. I was not wholly unprepared for the shock, but it has been my observation that no matter how securely one braces oneself to receive a blow, one staggers under it when it is actually delivered. Santa Claus was a fake, then. My face grew hot at the thought that I had been imposed upon by my own trusted friends. So he wasn't a jolly old saint at all. He was a jolly old fraud, assuming that he was jolly and old. I shouted the equivalent of that sentiment at my mother, almost too boisterously. She said gently, "No, my dear, Santa Claus is not a fraud. Santa Claus is just a child's name for something a child couldn't understand by its right name. Don't you remember when you learned your letters how you first picked out A from the others? There was a picture of a dog on the other side of the block, I recalled. Yes, and when we asked you to find A, you had to fumble about among the blocks until you found the dog. That was A. But A doesn't mean dog any more, does it? Now, Santa Claus is just an idea that stands for Christmas love and Christmas helpfulness and Christmas cheer until one is wise enough to know what such things mean." "But, Mother," I protested, "why didn't you tell me a year ago? I would have understood. I know I would." "Oh, perhaps you are right," she agreed. "It's hard to know always just what to do." We were both silent for a little while, and she resumed, "Do you remember the time you helped the wee baby chicken out of its shell?" I remembered. It had been very bad for the chicken. "Do you see what I mean?" my mother asked quietly. I brightened and assured her that I understood perfectly. The chicken should have been left to get out of its shell without help. It wasn't ready to get out at all until it got itself out. Same way with me. I wasn't ready to let go of Santa Claus until I did it of my own accord. Yes, I understood perfectly. I didn't, though. One must see much more serious examples of the human struggles to arise out of the realm of myth into the domain of truth by the process of reducing early ideas from the domain of truth to the realm of myth before one understands this proposition perfectly. And seeing how very poorly I have stated this, I know my understanding of it is quite imperfect at the present moment. Well, after that, for more than a score of years, my interest in Santa Claus was restricted to a smiling, patient tolerance exhibited toward all persons who professed belief in him. Through the little group of years immediately following my apostasy, I achieved a conscious pride in my ability to assist my juniors in the retention of their delusion, though whether it was to atone for the premature deliverance and death of the chicken, or for sheer love of exercising my imagination, I do not now recall. But it always struck me as an unworthy act to kick the props out from under somebody's faith in anything that promotes his happiness. I think that to this day. Of course, we all want to know the truth, and truth is eternal and unchanging, if you insist. So is the moon, for all practical purposes, but the moon has a habit of appearing to our eyes in various forms, the same old moon all the time. 3 years ago I knew that no Christian would fight, regardless of the circumstances. I would have staked my last crust on that proposition as the truth. I know now that no Christian can refuse to fight under certain circumstances. That is the truth. Maybe. At all events, one learns as one grows balder and fatter that it's a very serious business to tamper with other people's convictions. We become assured of that fact after we have had a few of our own pet theories swept out at the back door to be carted off by the ashman. Whoever thinks he is anchored fast to anything permanent, therefore, let him be wary about weighing his anchor on the advice of some skipper who himself may be tied up to a floating dock. I was trying to say, when this interruption occurred, that for the space of more than 20 years Santa Claus, so far as I was concerned, sat among such folk as Mother Goose, Old King Cole, and the Pied Piper. Then one day he arose and waddled into my life again, with the assurance that he bore me no grudge on account of my long neglect, and was there anything he could do for me. Of course, he couldn't possibly be returned to his old standing, but he contrived to find a place in my heart again. I saw my long-lost faith in him mirrored in wide eyes that were full of wonder and bright with expectation of his advent. Yes, Santa Claus was really coming again. I am not sure, but I realized more pleasure in his revival than of his earlier acquaintance. Every Christmas he came triumphantly, doubtless much amused over the ardent interest that he excited in one who had so long disclaimed him. Then one day, no, not one day, for this thing that happened was not the work of one day, but a soul-torturing process that covered a period so long that I can hardly remember the dim epoch when it began. Everybody confessed to a feeling of disgust For all things, all forces, all facts, all fancies emanating from a certain country, which we hoped was not united to do the crimes predicated of it, but which proved as the days passed that it was divided only by the 52 degrees of north latitude. Otherwise it was all of a piece. It had sold its soul. It was proud of its bargain. It didn't need a soul any more. So utterly foul did that country and its people become, in our opinion, that we shifted nervously in our seats when the orchestra played something that had been born of them. Our fists clenched automatically when we heard their gutturals voiced on the street. Now, Santa Claus is a native-born German. What's to be done about it? Shall we consider him a naturalized American on the strength of our affectionate interest in him? In that case, perhaps we should trim his beard, outfit him in unmistakable American clothes, and stoutly prohibit his habit of carrying those little German cakes about with him in his capacious pockets, and all the silly little trinkets that he used to hang on our Christmas trees, every one of them German. Shall we not demand him to stop dealing in such objectionable ornaments? Let us strip him of everything even faintly suggestive of that country whose people butcher for the love of the tang in the scent of warm blood. Now, just a minute. Let's think this through quietly. This is Christmas, you know. If we must consider it our patriotic duty to hate, maybe we can do our full annual share of it in 364 days. Surely we are entitled to 1 day's vacation, and Christmas seems to be a pretty good day to knock off hating for a few hours. This awful thing that has been going on is now ended. Whoever doubts that the German people have earned the disgust and distrust of honest humanity deserves to be locked up. But we can't kill all the Germans and destroy all their cities and plow up their country and sow it in dog fennel. By the time all our post-bellicose diplomatic chatter is concluded, there will be about as many Germans to the cubic yard as there were before. We will have them to deal with, whether we like it or not. After a while, we will begin to treat them with kindness. Indeed, if we do not, there will be something missing from our program which involves a square deal for everybody on earth. It requires a tremendous outlay of nervous energy to hate the way we have been hating. We cannot expect to keep our hating machinery running like that at top speed and under forced draft forever and ever. Do you remember the story of the cruel and treacherous warlords of Samaria, Sanballat and Tobiah? If ever there was a pair of rapscallion cutthroats and treaty breakers, these two should be cited early, and the Samaritan people aided and abetted them in their disgraceful crimes. But what do you mean when you speak of something as a Samaritan? Do you mean that he is an assassin? Why, the time came when the world's greatest teacher found a Samaritan who typified the finest spirit of philanthropy. Good Samaritan comes very nearly being one word in our thought. Some day we are going to be anxious to discover just the tiniest fact of mutual interest and mutual affection to serve as a basis for the amity which must be brought about between ourselves and our dishonored enemy, if our war sacrifices are to be fully justified. Suppose we say that Santa Claus is a decent German, and permit him to retain his old habits and traditions. Why Santa Claus, you ask? Well, you see, the people who know that Santa Claus is real, some 4,500,000 of them, as I told you, have not yet achieved the final art of hating. They don't care a fig whether Santa Claus is a native German, Turk, Hottentot, or Simian. Now, if he is real to them, and if they are satisfied with him as he is, why should you and I undertake to tamper with their cherished friend when we disbelieve in his very existence? let them have him without the loss of a single button. Oh, you 4,500,000 unhating, unscathed, carefree little chaps, keep your Santa Claus. Maybe he will help you patch things up across the way sometime. We cannot do it. It is flat against reason and sense to expect us to assist very much in the reconciliation program. Our part of this redemption plan is purely surgical. Whatever post-operative nursing is to be done seems to be your task. There is no reason why you should learn to hate. We have had to do it, and it has made us old before our time, and we have days when we despise our own thoughts. You keep clear of hate, and hold you fast to Santa Claus. Perhaps some people, just because this is Christmas, will consent to go a step further with me in this soliloquy and apostrophize the believers in Santa Claus over in the country that has caused us so much sorrow. Oh, you half-starved babies, once potential slaves, now faced with the possibility of being free of the fetters that awaited you. Hold you fast to Santa Claus, too, for he will surely come to you soon if all things end rightly. And in future days may our little boys and girls have occasion to think better of you than their fathers have had to think of your fathers, to the end that peace and goodwill among men shall be the blessed heritage of all, including you. End of Part 11. End of A Christmas Miscellany 2023 by various authors.